Hello everyone, I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. The night shift at Whispering Oaks Equestrian Center pays better than it should for a reason most people don't ask about. 3 guards quit in the past 6 months, each claiming the place felt wrong after dark. I took the job because I needed the money and because I've always preferred the quiet honesty of nighttime to the performative bustle of day. The center closed 2 years ago when the owner died, leaving behind empty stables, cobwebbed riding arenas, and the lingering scent of hay that never quite fades from places where horses once lived. My rounds take me through the main barn, the equipment shed, and the indoor arena where moonlight filters through grimy skylights, casting everything in silver-edged shadows. It was during my 3rd week that I found the metal. I was checking the old tack room when my flashlight beam caught something metallic wedged between loose floorboards. The wood gave way easily, too easily, as if it had been disturbed recently. My fingers closed around a circular object about the size of a silver dollar, its surface cool, despite the autumn warmth still trapped in the building. Under my light, intricate engravings emerged. A crescent moon surrounded by symbols I didn't recognize, and along the edge, letters that might have been Latin. The metal felt older than it looked, worn smooth in places as if handled frequently. On the reverse side, barely legible scratches spelled out H. Froelich, 1923. I pocketed the metal and continued my rounds, thinking little of it beyond idle curiosity about its previous owner. The name sounded Dutch, like mine, though I'd been born and raised in Pennsylvania after my grandparents immigrated. The first text arrived at 2:17 a.m. 3 days later. "You're looking at the metal again." I nearly dropped my phone. The screen showed no sender, no number, just those 6 words appearing as if typed by the device itself. I glanced around the empty break room where I'd been examining the artifact during my meal break, my skin prickling with the sudden certainty that I was being watched. Outside, wind rattled the loose siding of the barn, but inside, the silence felt expectant, pregnant with possibility. I typed back, "Who is this?" No response came, but my fingers unconsciously found the metal in my pocket, its surface now warm against my palm. The second message arrived an hour later as I walked through the main stable. "Your footsteps echo differently in stall number 7. I stopped mid-stride. The observation was accurate. The 7th stall did have a strange acoustic quality, probably due to water damage in the concrete below. But how could anyone know where I was walking unless they were here, in the building, watching? My flashlight beam swept the shadows between the stalls, illuminating nothing but dust motes dancing in the air. The silence stretched taut as a wire, broken only by the distant settling of old wood and the whisper of autumn wind through gaps in the walls. "How are you watching me?" I texted back. This time the response was immediate. "Through eyes that see what yours cannot." A chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the temperature. I quickened my pace through the remaining stalls, eager to finish my rounds and retreat to the security office with its reinforced windows and multiple exit routes. But the messages didn't stop. Over the following nights, they became more frequent and disturbingly accurate. Descriptions of which light switches I used, observations about how I unconsciously rubbed my left shoulder when nervous, comments on thoughts I'd barely formed myself. You're wondering if the metal belonged to someone who worked here before the center opened. You just remembered your grandmother mentioning a Hendrik who disappeared in America. You're afraid to research the name but can't stop thinking about it. Each message felt like a violation, as if invisible fingers were rifling through my mind. I started leaving my phone in the office during rounds, but somehow the messages still appeared when I returned, timestamped to correspond exactly with my activities. Sleep became elusive. During the day, exhaustion weighed on me like a heavy coat, but my mind remained hyper-alert, cataloging every sound in my apartment, every shadow that might conceal an observer. I found myself checking my phone compulsively, both dreading and anticipating the next intrusion. The messages began, including instructions. Go to the tack room. Look behind the saddle racks. Against my better judgment, I obeyed. Behind dusty leather equipment, I found a leather journal, its pages brittle with age. The first entry was dated September 15th, 1923, written in the same hand that had scratched the name on the metal. My name is Hendrik Vrolik, and I fear I am losing my mind. The journal chronicled Hendrik's deterioration with painful honesty. He'd been the head groom at a private stable that once occupied this site, caring for a dozen horses with the devotion of a man who understood animals better than people. But something had changed after he'd found what he called the lunar token, buried beneath the stable floor. The voice speaks to me now, through words that appear in my ledger as if written by an invisible hand. It knows my thoughts before I think them, my actions before I perform them. It demands I complete a ritual begun by whoever buried the token here, a ceremony to bind the spirit of the place to the will of one who serves it. The entries became increasingly erratic, describing sleepless nights and visions of figures moving through the stable. Figures that weren't quite human, but weren't quite anything else either. Hendrik wrote of horses becoming agitated in his presence, of sounds with no source, of the growing certainty that he was merely a puppet dancing to the rhythm of an ancient and malevolent intelligence. The ritual requires blood freely given during the dark of the moon. Not to harm, it insists, but to seal a covenant. Yet I have seen what happens to those who complete such covenants. In the old country, my grandfather spoke of men who made bargains with things that should not be, and how they were never quite themselves afterward. The final entry was barely legible. I have hidden the token where none will find it. The voice will sleep until another awakens it. God forgive me for what I have almost done. My hands shook as I closed the journal. The paper felt fragile as tissue, and several pages crumbled at my touch. But the implication was clear. I was reenacting Hendrik's torment, following in the footsteps of a man who had barely escaped something terrible. My phone buzzed. You understand now. The words appeared without sound, as if the device had been muted. Around me, the tack room felt smaller, the shadows deeper despite my flashlight's steady beam. The ritual must be completed. The covenant must be sealed. No, I typed back. I won't do it. You will. In time, resistance becomes impossible. Hendrik discovered this. I fled the tack room, my footsteps echoing hollowly through the empty stable. But I couldn't flee the messages, which continued to appear with relentless persistence. The moon will be dark in 3 nights. Preparations must be made. Go to the paddock behind the arena. I didn't want to obey, but my feet carried me there anyway, as if independent of my conscious will. The paddock gate stood open, revealing a single occupant, a bay stallion that shouldn't have been there. The horse was magnificent despite his obvious age, probably 20 or more, if the gray around his muzzle was any indication. He stood perfectly still in the moonlight, his dark eyes fixed on me with an intelligence that seemed almost human. There was no halter, no rope, nothing to keep him confined except his own apparent choice to remain. As I approached, he turned his head slightly and I heard it, a soft whicker that sounded almost like words, almost like recognition. My phone buzzed again. His name is Shadowmere. He has been waiting. The stallion took a step toward me, then another, until we stood close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from his massive frame. His nostrils flared as he scented me, and when I reached out tentatively, he allowed my hand to rest against his neck. His pulse was steady and strong beneath my palm, but something else thrummed there too, a vibration that seemed to resonate with the metal in my pocket. The metal had grown hot against my leg, as if responding to the horse's proximity. He hears it too, came the next message. The voice that calls from beyond the veil. He has been its guardian and its prisoner for longer than any horse should live. I stared at the stallion's eyes and saw something that made my breath catch. There was recognition there, and a weariness that spoke of decades spent listening to whispers from somewhere else. How long had he been here, hidden away from the world, sustained by whatever force had claimed this place? The ritual will free him, the messages continued, and bind you to serve in his place. The horse stepped back, shaking his magnificent head, as if disagreeing with the voice that spoke through my phone. His movement broke whatever spell had held me motionless, and I stumbled backward, my rational mind reasserting itself. This was madness. I was a night security guard, not a character in some gothic horror story. There had to be a logical explanation for everything: the messages, the horse, even the journal. Even, someone was playing an elaborate prank, using technology I didn't understand to make me believe in supernatural nonsense. But even as I tried to convince myself, I knew the explanation felt hollow. The details were too precise, too personal. The horse's presence too impossible to dismiss. Over the next 2 nights, the messages became more insistent, describing the ritual in disturbing detail. It wasn't the blood sacrifice I'd feared, but something worse. A voluntary surrender of will. A conscious choice to become a conduit for whatever intelligence lurked in this place. Place your hand on the stallion's forehead as the moon dies. Speak the words written on the inner circle of the metal. Feel your consciousness merge with the voice that has been calling you. You will still be yourself, but you will also be more. You will see beyond the boundaries of ordinary perception. You will hear the whispers of things that exist between worlds. You will never be alone again. The promises felt seductive in the long hours of darkness, when isolation pressed against me like a living thing. But I remembered Hendrik's words about his grandfather's stories, about men who were never quite themselves afterward. On the night of the new moon, I made my decision. I arrived at work carrying a small camping shovel I'd bought during the day. If burying the metal had silenced the voice for Hendrik, perhaps it would work for me too. The weight of the artifact in my pocket felt heavier than ever, as if it had grown denser with approaching fulfillment. The messages started before I'd even clocked in. Tonight, the covenant is sealed. Tonight, you join the Eternal Watch. Go to the paddock. Shadowmere is waiting. I ignored my phone and headed straight for the tack room. I would bury the metal in the same spot where Hendrik had hidden it, deeper this time, beyond the reach of future night guards or curious workers. But the floorboards wouldn't give way. My shovel blade struck concrete where loose wood should have been. The floor had been repaired, reinforced, made impregnable to excavation. You cannot escape destiny by repeating the past. Frustrated, I tried the equipment shed, then various spots around the stable grounds. Each location proved impossible to dig. The soil was either too rocky or revealed itself to be concrete just below the surface. Every potential hiding spot had been somehow protected against disturbance. My phone screen lit up with a constant stream of messages now. No longer individual texts, but a flowing conversation from an entity that seemed to be growing stronger as midnight approached. Hendrik delayed the inevitable by 9 decades. The voice has been patient, but patience has its limits. You feel it now, don't you? The pull toward the paddock, the need to complete what was begun. Your feet are already carrying you there. I looked down and realized with horror that I was indeed walking toward the paddock, my body moving with purpose, while my mind struggled to assert control. The stallion stood waiting in the center of the enclosure, his dark coat almost invisible against the moonless sky except for the faint stars reflected in his eyes. As I approached the gate, every rational thought urged me to run, but my hand was already reaching for the latch, my legs carrying me forward with inexorable momentum. The metal in my pocket burned like a coal against my thigh. Shadowmere whickered softly as I entered the paddock, a sound that contained both welcome and warning. Up close, I could see that his coat bore scars, not from violence, but from something else. Symbols had been carved into his hide long ago, healed but still visible, forming patterns that matched the engravings on the metal. Place your hand on his forehead. The instruction came not through my phone now, but directly into my mind, bypassing my ears entirely. The voice was clearer than it had ever been. Neither male nor female, but something beyond such distinctions. Speak the words. Complete the binding. I pulled the metal from my pocket and found the Latin phrases etched around its rim suddenly comprehensible, as if a lifetime of classical education had been downloaded into my brain in an instant. The words wanted to be spoken, pressing against my lips with desperate urgency. But as I raised my free hand toward the stallion's head, He did something unexpected. He stepped backward and shook his head, not in the way horses typically do, but with deliberate, almost human negation. His eyes met mine, and in them I saw not the ancient wisdom of a creature touched by otherworldly forces, but something far more mundane and infinitely more precious. Choice. The voice in my head grew louder, more insistent, but the horse continued to back away, maintaining the distance between us. He was showing me something Hendrik perhaps had never understood. Even an entity of immense power couldn't force a truly willing sacrifice. The ritual required consent, not just compliance but genuine acceptance of the bargain being offered, and both Shadowmere and I still possessed the ability to refuse. I closed my fist around the metal and felt its surface crack under the pressure. Whatever metal it was made from was more fragile than it appeared, splitting along invisible fault lines that had perhaps been weakened by decades of waiting. The voice became a shriek of rage that seemed to come from the ground itself, from the air, from everywhere and nowhere. But as the metal crumbled to powder in my hand, the supernatural pressure lifted, leaving behind only ordinary silence and the soft breathing of an old horse who had finally been released from a burden no animal should carry. Shadowmere tossed his head once more, this time in what looked remarkably like approval, before turning and walking away into the darkness beyond the paddock. I never saw him again. The next morning, I submitted my resignation via email, citing personal reasons. I never returned to Whispering Oaks, though I heard through local news that the property was sold the following month to developers who planned to build a shopping complex. Sometimes, late at night, I still wonder about that final moment in the paddock. Was I truly in the presence of something supernatural, or had I simply suffered a psychological break brought on by isolation and suggestion? The rational part of my mind insists it must have been the latter, a complex delusion triggered by finding an old journal and letting my imagination run wild. But I can't explain how my phone received messages with no sender, or where the stallion came from, or why the property sale records show no mention of livestock that needed relocation. And sometimes, when the night is particularly dark and quiet, I find myself checking my phone for messages that will never come, from a voice that may have been silenced forever, or may simply be waiting for the next night guard to find whatever token replaces the one I destroyed. The uncertainty should disturb me more than it does. But perhaps some questions are meant to remain unanswered, existing in the space between explanation and mystery, where the most important truths often live. I sleep better now anyway, most nights. Story 2. The IMAX theater at 4 a.m. feels like a cathedral built for giants, empty pews stretching toward a screen that could swallow the moon. My footsteps echo against polished concrete as I wheel the industrial cart through the main entrance, the wheels squeaking in a rhythm that sounds almost like breathing. The management promised this would be easy money for a college freshman: sweep the aisles, mop the concession area, empty the trash. What they didn't mention was how the darkness here feels alive, pressing against the emergency lighting like something hungry trying to get in. The projectionist booth looms above the seating area, its windows reflecting my movements as I work. Every few minutes, the massive projection equipment groans, a mechanical sound that shouldn't happen when no film is running. The theater manager assured me it was normal, just the machinery settling, but the noise carries an organic quality that makes my skin crawl. It's rhythmic, almost like labored breathing, and each mechanical wheeze seems to sync with my own pulse. I focus on the work, methodically moving through each row of seats. The red velvet absorbs sound in unnatural ways, making my movements feel muffled and dreamlike. Dropped popcorn kernels crunch under my feet with startling clarity, each snap magnified in the vast space. The emergency lighting casts long shadows that shift and move as I pass, creating the illusion of figures sitting in seats I've already cleaned. The first time I hear the footsteps above, I convince myself it's the building settling. Heavy, deliberate steps moving across the projection booth floor. But when I glance up through the booth windows, I see only darkness and the hulking silhouette of equipment. The footsteps stop when I stop, resume when I move. The pattern becomes so obvious that I find myself standing perfectly still, listening to silence that feels more ominous than any sound. My earbuds provide some comfort, classic rock drowning out the theater's whispers and sighs. But when one earbud slips out and falls, hitting the concrete with a small plastic crack, the sound that emerges from the theater's speakers makes my blood freeze. It's my own heartbeat, amplified and distorted, pumping through the surround sound system with bass that vibrates through my bones. The rhythm is perfect, matching my pulse beat for beat, even accelerating as my panic rises. I scramble to retrieve the earbud, jamming it back into my ear as the heartbeat fades from the speakers. The music resumes, but now it feels like a thin barrier between me and something that wants my attention. My hands shake as I continue cleaning, trying to rationalize what I've heard. Sound systems malfunction, old theaters have quirks. But the precision of that heartbeat, the way it matched mine so perfectly, suggests something more intentional than mechanical failure. The concession area offers no refuge. The popcorn machines stand like sleeping giants, their stainless steel surfaces reflecting my face in warped, multiplied images. The candy display cases hum with a frequency that seems to harmonize with the projection equipment's breathing. I mop the floors mechanically, the chemical smell of cleaning solution mixing with the lingering aroma of butter and salt, creating a nauseating sweetness that coats the back of my throat. When I return to the main theater, something has changed. The screen, which should be blank and dormant, flickers with a faint light, not the bright illumination of a projection, but a subtle glow like phosphorescence on deep water. I keep my eyes fixed on the floor, remembering the security guard's warning about not looking at the screens during my shift. His words had seemed like superstitious nonsense when he briefed me, mumbled warnings about previous cleaning crew members who'd quit without explanation. But he'd mentioned other things too, details that seemed too specific to be fabrication. The former projectionist who'd worked here for 30 years before his sudden death from a heart attack, found slumped over the equipment at dawn, how he'd been obsessed with preserving every frame of film that passed through his booth, collecting discarded cuts and damaged reels like precious artifacts. The security guard had used an odd phrase, celluloid children, to describe what the old man had supposedly left behind. The footsteps above grow more frequent, sometimes moving in patterns that mirror my own path through the theater. When I move to the left side of the seating area, the steps track to the left side of the booth. When I circle around to the center aisle, the movement above follows. It becomes a dance of sorts, my earthbound partner shadowing every step from the darkness above. But the booth remains empty whenever I dare to glance up, showing only the motionless bulk of projection equipment. My earbuds cut out completely around 5 a.m., the music dying mid-song. In the resulting silence, I hear something that makes my throat close with fear. It's my own voice, drifting from the theater's speakers with the hollow quality of a recording. But the words aren't anything I remember saying. Fragments of conversation, half-finished thoughts, all in my exact tone and inflection. The voice discusses classes I'm taking, professors I've mentioned to no one in this building, private worries about college expenses and fitting in. It's intimate information delivered in my own vocal patterns, as if someone had been recording my phone calls and editing them into a strange soliloquy. The effect is deeply violating, like hearing your thoughts spoken aloud by a stranger wearing your face. I try to focus on cleaning, but the voice continues its monologue, jumping between topics with the logic of dreams. Sometimes it addresses someone directly, carrying on one side of conversations I've never had. Other times it mutters to itself, expressing doubts and fears I recognize as my own but have never voiced. The familiarity is worse than any ghost story. It's my own thoughts turned against me, my privacy excavated and displayed. The projection equipment grows louder as the morning progresses, its breathing becoming labored and irregular. Sometimes it sounds like laughter, other times like sobbing. The mechanical noises layer over each other in impossible ways, creating harmonics that shouldn't exist in simple machinery. I begin to wonder if the old projectionist somehow left part of himself in these machines, his obsession with film becoming something more literal than metaphorical. The screen's glow intensifies, and I catch glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision, shapes and shadows that suggest figures moving across its surface. Every instinct screams at me to look directly, to see what's being projected in this empty theater. But the security guard's warning echoes in my mind, along with his haunted expression when he'd mentioned the cleaning crew members who'd disappeared. They hadn't quit, I realize now. They'd vanished during their shifts, leaving only their cleaning supplies behind. The thought should terrify me into fleeing, but I need this job desperately. College expenses mount daily, and opportunities for work-study positions are rare. I force myself to continue, keeping my eyes fixed downward as the screen pulses with increasing brightness. My own voice from the speakers begins to stutter and repeat, like a broken record skipping over the same groove. Words fragment into syllables, syllables into sounds that barely resemble human speech. But underneath the distortion, I hear something else. Other voices, unfamiliar but using the same inflections, as if my speech patterns have been grafted onto different people. A chorus of strangers speaking with my tongue, discussing lives I've never lived. The realization hits me with sickening clarity. I'm not the first person whose voice has been captured here. The theater has been collecting them, these celluloid children the security guard mentioned. Each cleaning crew member, each late-night visitor, adds their voice to the collection. And now they're trying to add mine, drawing me deeper into whatever process created them. I work faster, desperate to finish my shift and escape. But the theater seems to expand around me, the rows of seats stretching longer than before, the screen looming larger and more insistent. The glow from its surface throws dancing shadows on the walls, creating the illusion of an audience that shifts and moves just outside my direct vision. I hear rustling, like hundreds of people settling into their seats for a show. The voices from the speakers multiply, becoming a crowd of my own voice speaking in unison. They discuss my life, my fears, my dreams, but with small variations that suggest different perspectives on the same experiences. It's as if multiple versions of myself are having a conference, comparing notes on what it means to be me. The effect is maddening, too familiar to dismiss, too wrong to accept. By 6 a.m., the projection equipment has reached a crescendo of activity. Mechanical arms move in the booth above, threading film that shouldn't exist through machinery that should be dormant. I hear the whisper of celluloid running through guides and sprockets, but when I risk a glance upward, the booth appears empty as always. The contradiction makes my head spin. Visible effects from invisible causes, sounds without sources. The screen blazes with light now, demanding attention I refuse to give. But in the reflection on the polished concrete floor, I catch fragmented images. Scenes that feel familiar but impossible. I see myself in situations I've never experienced, conversations I've never had, places I've never been. The reflected images show my life expanded and multiplied, versions of my existence that branch into infinite possibilities. My radio crackles, the security guard checking in, his voice distorted by static that sounds almost like whispers. He asks if everything is going smoothly, if I've encountered any problems. I want to tell him about the voices, the footsteps, the impossible light show playing above my head. But my own voice emerges from the theater speakers before I can speak, answering in my exact tone that everything is fine, that I'm almost finished with my shift. The guard seems satisfied with this response, signing off with the promise that morning staff will arrive soon. But I never spoke those words. Something else answered for me, using my voice so perfectly that even I can't detect a difference. The implications crash over me like cold water. If it can speak for me, what else can it do? How long has it been watching, learning, preparing to replace me entirely? The final hour of my shift stretches like taffy, each minute extending far beyond 60 seconds. I move through the remaining tasks mechanically, desperate to avoid looking at the screen that pulses and flickers with increasing urgency. The voices from the speakers have organized themselves into a strange harmony, my voice singing songs I don't know in languages I don't recognize. But the melody is hauntingly beautiful, almost hypnotic, and I find my movements unconsciously keeping time with the rhythm. Dawn light begins to filter through the theater's entrance, and the supernatural activity gradually subsides. The footsteps above fade to silence. The voices from the speakers dwindle to whispers, then nothing. The screen's glow dims to its normal dormant state, leaving only the reflection of emergency lighting on its surface. But I know what I've experienced isn't imagination. The old projectionist's celluloid children are real, and they've been trying to add me to their collection. As I pack up my cleaning supplies, I notice something that stops me cold. Scattered across the floor where I've been working are small strips of film, translucent pieces of celluloid that weren't there when I started. I pick one up, holding it to the light, and see images I don't recognize. A young man who looks like me but isn't me, cleaning the same theater, making the same movements, but in subtly different ways. The morning staff arrives as I'm wheeling my cart toward the exit. They nod politely, commenting on how clean everything looks, how efficiently I work. But I notice they avoid looking directly at the screen, just as I have. They know something too, these day shift workers. They've learned the same survival instincts I discovered during my long night. The security guard catches me at the exit, asking how my first shift went. I tell him it was fine, that I'm eager to continue the work. But as I speak, I hear my words echoing faintly from the theater behind me, repeated by voices that sound exactly like mine but somehow aren't. He hears it too. I see the recognition in his eyes, the mixture of pity and understanding. He hands me my time card and mentions that the previous cleaning crew member had been very dedicated, working for nearly 6 months before moving on to other opportunities. But his phrasing is careful, deliberately vague, and I suspect that moving on might not mean what it typically implies. I think about the film strips I found, the images of someone who looked like me but wasn't quite right, and wonder if dedication might be another word for disappearance. Walking across the parking lot in the early morning light, I feel eyes watching from the theater's windows. But when I turn back, I see only dark glass reflecting the sunrise. My car starts normally. The radio plays familiar songs, and the world outside the theater seems reassuringly ordinary. But I carry the voices with me, my own voice, multiplied and distorted, discussing a life that might be mine or might be someone else's entirely. I drive home knowing I'll return tomorrow night, and the night after that. Not because I want to, but because something in that theater has already begun the process of collection. My voice is now part of their chorus, my image captured on strips of impossible film. The celluloid children have begun their work, and I'm no longer certain where I end and they begin. The worst part isn't the supernatural elements or the threat of disappearance. It's the growing suspicion that this experience, this job, this terror, this gradual dissolution of self, might not be happening to me at all. I might be one of the voices already, might be one of the images on those film strips, playing out a role in someone else's horror story. The line between observer and observed has blurred beyond recognition, and I'm no longer sure which side of the screen I actually occupy. But tomorrow night, I'll return to find out. Story 3. The backstage air hung thick with the metallic scent of stage makeup and nervous sweat. I pressed my palm against the cool brick wall, feeling the vibrations of muffled conversations seeping through from the auditorium beyond. 5 minutes until curtain. The weight of opening night pressed down on my shoulders like a familiar, unwelcome friend. I'd been stage managing for the Riverside Community Theater for 3 years, and the pre-show ritual never changed. Check props, verify lighting cues, calm the actors' nerves, and deliver the time calls with military precision. Tonight felt different, though. The air itself seemed to hum with an electric anticipation that made my skin crawl. The hallway stretched before me, dimly lit by the amber work lights that cast long, wavering shadows across the floor. Water pipes groaned somewhere in the walls, and the old building settled with a deep, resonant sigh that seemed to echo my own unease. I straightened my shoulders and began my final rounds. 5 minutes to places. My voice rang out clearly, cutting through the backstage murmur. The response came immediately from various corners of the building. Acknowledgements from actors making final adjustments to costumes, from crew members checking their stations one last time. But as my voice faded, another voice followed, softer but distinct. "Thank you." I paused, my hand hovering over the doorknob to the women's dressing room. The voice had been feminine, polite, carrying that particular cadence actors developed, trained projection even in casual conversation. Yet something about it felt off, like an echo that arrived before the original sound. The dressing room door was locked. Sarah, our lead actress, had mentioned stepping outside for fresh air 10 minutes ago. The other female cast members were scattered throughout the building, and I just heard their responses from different locations. I knocked gently. "Hello? Everything okay in there?" Silence. The brass key felt cold between my fingers as I turned the lock. The hinges protested with a soft whine that seemed to stretch longer than it should. Inside, the familiar chaos of opening night preparation greeted me. Makeup scattered across the vanity, costumes hanging on portable racks, the lingering scent of hairspray and perfume. But the room was empty. What drew my attention wasn't the absence of people, but the mirror. The large vanity mirror, usually spotless and bright, was fogged from the inside, as if someone had been breathing heavily against the glass from within. Condensation clung to its surface in uneven patches, distorting the reflection it cast back at me. I stepped closer, my footsteps muffled by the worn carpet. In the mirror, my reflection moved sluggishly, like an image struggling through thick water. There was a lag, barely perceptible, but definitely there. When I raised my hand, my reflection followed a beat behind, as if it were learning the gesture rather than mimicking it. The condensation began to clear as I watched, revealing my face in perfect detail. But for just a moment, in my peripheral vision, I could have sworn I saw another figure standing beside me. A woman in period costume, her lips moving silently as if rehearsing lines. I spun around. Empty room. Empty space where she should have been standing. My hands trembled as I pulled out my phone to check the time. 3 minutes to places. The actors would be gathering in the wing soon, and I needed to focus. Community theater ran on tight schedules and tighter budgets. There was no room for stage managers who saw things that weren't there. 3 minutes to places, I called out, stepping back into the hallway. The building absorbed my voice, and for a moment the usual responses seemed muted, distant. Then I heard it again, clearer this time, coming from somewhere behind me. 3 minutes to places. My voice. Exactly my voice, with the same inflection, the same slight rasp from years of cigarettes I'd quit 5 years ago. The echo bounced off the walls, but it wasn't an echo. It was a perfect reproduction, as if someone else were making the same call from a parallel location. I turned back toward the dressing room, but the door had swung shut again. The lock clicked with a soft, decisive sound that seemed to reverberate through my bones. "Is someone back there?" I called out, louder this time. My voice cracked slightly, betraying the composure I was desperately trying to maintain. The building settled again, and in that settling, I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps, not the quick, purposeful steps of actors moving to their positions, but measured, deliberate movements that seemed to mirror my own path through the backstage area. I pressed my ear to the dressing room door. From within came the soft whisper of fabric rustling, the gentle clink of jewelry being adjusted, the subtle sounds of someone preparing for a performance. But I'd just been in there. The room had been empty. 2 minutes to places. The call left my lips automatically, part of a routine so ingrained I could perform it in my sleep. This time, the response was immediate and impossibly close. 2 minutes to places. The voice came from directly behind the dressing room door, spoken in my exact tone, but with a different intention. Where my call carried the authority of management, this one held the excitement of an actor about to take the stage. The doorknob wouldn't turn. I pulled out the key again, but my hands were shaking now, and it took 3 attempts to get it into the lock. The tumblers clicked, and I pushed the door open with more force than necessary. The mirror was clear now, reflecting the room in perfect detail. But the reflection showed things that weren't there. In the mirror, the vanity was arranged differently. Makeup containers sat in patterns I hadn't seen moments before. A costume hung on a hook that had been empty when I'd left. And there, in the corner of the reflected room, stood a woman. She was dressed in the same period costume our lead actress would wear, but the cut was different, older, as if from an earlier production of the same play. Her dark hair was styled in a way that suggested decades past, and her makeup was applied with the heavy hand of stage tradition, bold, dramatic, designed to be seen from the balcony seats. She was looking directly at me through the mirror, her lips moving in silent recitation of lines I couldn't hear but somehow recognized. Lines from our play, but delivered with subtle differences in timing and emphasis, as if she were performing a version I'd never seen. I reached out to touch the mirror's surface, and she did the same from her side. Our palms met against the glass, separated by what felt like mere inches, but might as well have been miles. Her touch was cold, and for a moment, I felt the sensation of fingers pressing against mine through the barrier. "Who are you?" I whispered. Her mouth formed words I couldn't hear, but I could read her lips clearly. "I'm the understudy." The lights in the room flickered, and when they steadied, she was gone. But her handprint remained on the mirror's surface, fogging the glass where her palm had pressed against mine. 1 minute to places. My voice came out hoarse, strained. In the mirror, I watched my reflection make the announcement, but noticed that my mouth kept moving after the words had ended, as if continuing a conversation I couldn't hear. The response came from everywhere at once, from the walls, from the ceiling, from the space behind my own voice. 1 minute to places. It was no longer just my voice echoing back. It was hers, layered beneath mine, creating a harmony that shouldn't have been possible. The sound filled the building, vibrating through the floorboards and up through my feet, settling in my chest like a second heartbeat. I stumbled backward out of the dressing room, pulling the door shut behind me. But I could still hear her moving inside, preparing for a performance that existed alongside ours but separate from it. The rustle of fabric, the soft scrape of chair legs against the floor, the gentle hum of someone warming up their voice, all the familiar sounds of an actor getting ready to take the stage. The hallway seemed longer now, stretching away from me in both directions like a funhouse mirror that distorted distance rather than shape. The amber work lights pulsed with my heartbeat, and the shadows they cast moved independently of their sources, reaching toward me with finger-like extensions. "Places, please. Places for the top of the show." The final call came from my lips, but as the words left my mouth, I realized I was no longer sure who was making them. Was it me, standing in the hallway with sweat beading on my forehead and doubt crawling up my spine? Or was it her, the woman in the mirror, the understudy who'd been waiting in the wings for her chance to perform? The actors moved past me toward their entrance positions, their faces bright with opening night energy. They nodded their thanks for the time calls, but something in their expressions suggested they were seeing someone else. Their eyes didn't quite meet mine, as if they were looking through me to acknowledge another stage manager, another voice guiding them through the pre-show routine. Sarah appeared from the side entrance, her costume perfect, her makeup flawless. She smiled as she passed, but the smile was directed slightly to my left, as if she were thanking someone standing beside me. "Break a leg," I managed to say, but my voice sounded hollow, distant. She nodded enthusiastically and mouthed back the traditional response, but she wasn't looking at me when she said it. The house lights dimmed, and the audience settled into expectant silence. From my position at the stage manager's station, I could see the actors in the wings, poised and ready. The lighting booth waited for my cue, and the sound operator had his hand hovering over the first music sequence. But when I reached for my headset to call the opening sequence, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. In the small monitor that showed the stage from the house camera, I could see not one but two groups of actors waiting in the wings. They occupied the same space but were clearly performing different versions of the same blocking, moving through familiar patterns with subtle variations that suggested different direction, different interpretation. One group I recognized. Our actors, our production, the version we'd been rehearsing for weeks. The other group moved with the confidence of a show that had been running for much longer, their gestures more polished, their positions adjusted by experience. And there, just visible at the edge of the camera's range, stood another figure at what appeared to be a second stage manager's station. The woman from the mirror, still in her period costume, but now with a headset around her neck and a clipboard in her hands. She was calling the same show I was calling, but her version was already in progress. "Light Q1, go," I whispered into my headset. From somewhere else in the theater, I heard the same words spoken with my voice, but with the confidence of someone who'd called this cue hundreds of times before. The lights came up on both versions of the stage simultaneously. Our actors began their performance, delivering lines they'd practiced and perfected. But underneath their voices, I could hear the same lines being spoken with different timing, different emphasis, as if two productions were running in parallel, occupying the same space but existing in different dimensions. The audience watched, apparently unaware that they were seeing a double exposure of reality. Their attention moved naturally with the blocking. Their laughter came at the expected moments, their silence held during the dramatic beats. But occasionally, I noticed heads turning slightly, as if they'd caught movement in their peripheral vision that didn't quite match what was happening center stage. Throughout the first act, I continued calling cues, but each one was echoed by my doppelganger, my understudy, the woman who seemed to be managing a production that existed just slightly out of phase with our own. Her version was smoother, more polished, as if she'd been running this show far longer than our mere 3 weeks of rehearsal. During intermission, I found myself back at the dressing room door. It was unlocked now, standing slightly ajar. Inside, I could hear the sounds of actors making costume changes, touching up makeup, discussing their performances with the quick, excited energy of people caught up in the magic of live theater. But when I pushed the door open, the room was empty again. The mirror reflected only me, standing alone among the scattered props and costumes. Yet the sounds continued. Voices, movement, the familiar intermission bustle of a successful production. I approached the mirror slowly, and as I did, the sounds seemed to grow clearer, more distinct. I could hear individual conversations now, recognize voices I almost knew but couldn't quite place. The woman I'd seen earlier was speaking to someone about adjusting a piece of blocking for the second act, her voice carrying the authority of experience. "You're not supposed to be here," I said to my reflection. But it was her voice that answered, coming from somewhere behind the glass. "Neither are you." The mirror began to fog again, and in the condensation, words appeared as if written by an invisible finger. Not words in any language I recognized, but somehow I understood their meaning. They spoke of productions that had come before, of actors who had performed these same roles in this same theater, of stage managers who had guided countless shows from the wings. The show must go on, the final message read. But which show? The second act began exactly as rehearsed, but I was no longer sure which rehearsal we were following. The actors moved with a confidence that seemed to draw from sources beyond our limited preparation time. Their performances had depth and nuance that suggested years of development rather than weeks. From my station, I watched both versions of the play unfold simultaneously. Our actors, bright and nervous with opening night energy, delivering their lines with the careful precision of recent learning, and the other cast, moving through the same moments with the fluid grace of long practice, their voices carrying the weight of countless performances. The lighting cues came naturally now, as if I were remembering them rather than calling them for the first time. The sound sequences flowed seamlessly, building the dramatic tension with precision that surprised even me. It was as if muscle memory were guiding my hands, drawing from experience I'd never had. As the final scene approached, I realized that the two productions were beginning to merge. Our actors were unconsciously adjusting their blocking to match the patterns I could see in the monitor, their line deliveries shifting subtly to accommodate timing that belonged to the other version. The woman in the mirror appeared one last time, standing beside me at what was now clearly revealed as a shared stage manager's station. She no longer seemed like an intruder or an apparition. Instead, she felt like a colleague, someone who understood the peculiar burden of guiding a production from the shadows, while the actors claimed the light. She nodded to me as the final cue approached, and together we called the last lighting sequence. Our voices merged into a single command that resonated through both versions of the theater. bringing both productions to their simultaneous conclusion. The applause was thunderous, coming from an audience that seemed larger than the house could hold. The actors took their bows, and in the monitor, I could see two complete casts sharing the same stage, occupying the same space without conflict, each receiving recognition for performances that were both identical and entirely different. As the curtain fell and the work lights came up, the theater returned to its normal dimensions. The actors began their post-show routine of makeup removal and costume hanging, chattering excitedly about the success of opening night. The other cast, the other production, faded like a film dissolving into white. But the woman in the mirror remained visible for a few moments longer. She removed her headset and placed it carefully on the station, then looked directly at me one final time. "Until tomorrow night," she mouthed, and her smile held the promise of endless performances yet to come. The mirror cleared completely, reflecting only the now empty dressing room. But I knew she was still there, waiting in the space between the glass and the silvering, ready to step in whenever the show needed her. I closed the dressing room door for the final time that night, but I didn't lock it. After all, she had her own key and her own show to manage. In the morning, I would convince myself that opening night stress had created illusions, that exhaustion had played tricks with my perception. But tomorrow night, when I called places for the second performance, I would listen carefully for the echo that arrived before my voice had finished speaking. And when I looked in mirrors, I would watch for the reflection that moved just slightly out of sync, showing me a version of myself that had been managing this theater far longer than I could remember. The show, after all, must go on. The only question was which version would claim the stage, and which would remain forever rehearsing in the wings, waiting for its moment to step into the light. As I turned off the work lights and locked the theater for the night, I could hear her voice one last time, calling out into the darkness with perfect professional clarity. "Good night, everyone. See you tomorrow." And despite everything, I found myself responding automatically, my voice joining hers in the traditional farewell. "See you tomorrow." But I was no longer certain who was saying it to whom, or which tomorrow we would meet in, or whether the theater I returned to would be the same one I was leaving behind. Story 4. The Atlantic forest breathes differently at night. I discovered this truth 3 hours into what was supposed to be a simple midnight hike, when the familiar weight of my own body began to feel like a lie. The trail had started normally enough. My headlamp carved a narrow tunnel through the darkness ahead, illuminating the familiar path I'd walked dozens of times during daylight hours. The dense canopy above blocked out most of the moonlight, creating a natural cathedral of shadows that should have felt comforting after years of research in these woods. Instead, every step forward felt like descending deeper into something ancient and hungry. The first anomaly wasn't the lights, it was the silence. By midnight, the forest should have been alive with the symphonic chaos of nocturnal creatures. Tree frogs calling to their mates, the rustle of small mammals through undergrowth, the distant hoot of owls hunting through the canopy. Instead, I walked through a vacuum of sound so complete that my own breathing seemed to echo back from the trees like an accusation. My breath clouded in the unusually cool air as I paused to check my GPS. The device showed my location correctly, but something felt wrong about the distance I'd covered. According to the coordinates, I should have reached the research station 20 minutes ago. Yet the trail continued stretching ahead into impenetrable darkness. That's when I saw them. Two orbs of pale blue light, no larger than tennis balls, hovering approximately 3 feet above the ground 30 yards ahead. They rotated around each other in a slow, hypnotic dance, their luminescence casting shifting shadows that seemed to move independently of their source. The lights pulsed with a rhythm that felt almost biological, like the beating of some massive, invisible heart. My scientific training kicked in immediately. Ball lightning, perhaps. Bioluminescent insects in an unusual formation. Reflected light from some distant source, though that seemed unlikely given our remote location. I reached for my camera, but my hands trembled as I fumbled with the equipment. The trembling bothered me more than the lights themselves. I'd encountered plenty of unexplained phenomena during my botanical research, and I prided myself on maintaining objective composure. As I raised the camera, the orbs began to retreat. They moved with deliberate purpose, maintaining their synchronized rotation while gliding backward down the trail. I followed, my boots crunching on the damp leaf litter that carpeted the forest floor. The sound of my footsteps seemed amplified in the unnatural quiet, each step announcing my presence to whatever intelligence might be guiding those impossible lights. The orbs led me off the main trail onto a narrow path I'd never noticed before, despite having mapped this section of forest extensively over the past 3 years. Ancient ferns brushed against my legs, their fronds leaving streaks of moisture on my hiking pants. The air grew thicker, laden with the rich sense of decomposition and new growth that characterized the forest's endless cycle of death and renewal. After perhaps 15 minutes of this strange procession, the light stopped at the base of a rocky outcropping that rose from the forest floor like a natural monument. The stone was darker than the surrounding granite formations, its surface smoothed by centuries of rainfall into something that resembled polished obsidian. As I approached, the orbs began to fade, their blue radiance dimming until they vanished entirely, leaving me alone with my headlamp and the oppressive weight of the watching forest. But they had brought me here for a reason. Carved into the rock face, approximately chest-high and clearly artificial, was a symbol unlike anything I'd encountered in my studies of indigenous Brazilian cultures. The carving was roughly 6 inches across, composed of interlocking spirals that seemed to spiral inward toward a central point. The lines weren't crude. They displayed a sophistication that suggested both artistic skill and deep symbolic meaning. Weather had softened some of the edges, but the overall design remained clearly visible, as if the rock itself was determined to preserve whatever message it contained. I ran my fingers along the carved lines, feeling the subtle texture where ancient tools had bitten into the stone. The rock was surprisingly warm to the touch, retaining heat despite the cool night air. As my fingertips traced the spiraling pattern toward its center, I felt a strange tingling sensation, like touching a weak electrical current. The moment my finger reached the central point of the spiral, I heard them. Footsteps, light, deliberate, approaching from behind me with the cautious rhythm of someone trying not to be detected. I spun around, my headlamp beam sweeping across the forest, but found nothing except trees and shadows. Yet the footsteps continued, now circling around me in a slow, predatory pattern. I called out, my voice cracking slightly with nervousness. The sound was immediately swallowed by the forest, as if the very air refused to carry it beyond a few feet. The footsteps paused, then resumed with increased intensity, now seeming to come from multiple directions simultaneously. I focused my light on the ground where the sound seemed strongest. There, pressed into the soft earth, were fresh footprints. But these weren't left by any boot or bare foot I recognized. The impressions were roughly human-sized but oddly shaped, as if made by feet that didn't quite conform to normal anatomy. More disturbing still, as I watched, new prints appeared in the mud, wet indentations forming in real time, as if invisible feet were pressing down into the earth with each phantom step. My hands shook as I swept the light back and forth, desperate to find the source of those materializing tracks. The beam caught something that made my blood freeze. The wet footprints weren't just appearing randomly. They were forming in a deliberate pattern, a spiral that matched the carved symbol on the rock, with me standing at the center. That's when I felt the lightness. It started as a subtle sensation, like the moment between sleep and waking when your body feels disconnected from the bed beneath it. But the feeling intensified rapidly, spreading from my feet upward, until my entire body felt as though it was being gently lifted by invisible hands. My boots remained planted on the forest floor, but some essential part of me seemed to be rising, as if something was attempting to extract my very essence from its physical container. The blue orbs reappeared, but this time they were above me, hovering at eye level and slowly ascending. Their light bathed my face in an ethereal glow that felt both beautiful and terrifying. I understood with sudden horrible clarity that they weren't just lights. They were something that had once been human, souls or spirits caught in the forest's embrace and transformed into eternal floating beacons. I was being invited to join them. The pulling sensation intensified, and I felt my consciousness beginning to separate from my body. It wasn't painful, quite the opposite. There was a seductive quality to the experience, a promise of release from the weight and limitations of physical existence. I could float above the forest canopy, become one with the ancient rhythms of this place, transform into pure light and energy. But some stubborn part of my mind resisted. I forced my attention back to the carved symbol, studying its intricate spirals with desperate focus. If this was some kind of trap or transformation, there had to be a way to reverse it. The symbol was clearly a key, but I needed to understand how to use it. As the lifting sensation grew stronger, I noticed something I'd missed before. The spirals weren't just decorative, they were directional. The carving was designed to be traced in a specific pattern, and I'd been following it inward, toward the center. What if the reverse was true? What if tracing the pattern outward, from center to edge, would break whatever force was trying to claim me? With enormous effort, I pressed my palm flat against the carved stone and began tracing the spiral in reverse, starting from the central point and working outward. The moment my finger began moving in the opposite direction, the pulling sensation lessened. The orbs above me flickered and descended slightly, their rotation becoming erratic. I continued tracing the pattern outward, fighting against the otherworldly force that was trying to lift me from the ground. Each line I completed in reverse seemed to strengthen my connection to my physical body, anchoring me more firmly to the earth. The invisible footsteps around me quickened, as if whatever presence was responsible for them was growing agitated by my resistance. When I completed the final, outermost curve of the spiral, the forest exploded back to life. The silence shattered as hundreds of nocturnal creatures resumed their activities all at once. Frogs calling, insects buzzing, leaves rustling with the movement of small animals. The oppressive weight that had been pressing down on the forest lifted, and I could breathe freely again. The blue orbs flickered once more, then vanished completely, leaving me alone with my headlamp and the suddenly normal sounds of the Atlantic forest at night. But I wasn't unchanged by the experience. As I stumbled back toward the main trail, guided by my GPS and shaking legs, I became aware of a fundamental shift in my perception. The forest around me seemed more alive than before, not just in the biological sense, but in some deeper, more mysterious way. I could feel the presence of ancient things watching from the shadows, not malevolent exactly, but alien and incomprehensible. And I could still feel the lightness. It was subtle now, manageable, but definitely present. When I walked, it felt as though my feet barely touched the ground. When I reached for my water bottle, my hand seemed to float toward it rather than move through deliberate muscle control. Whatever had been done to me at that carved stone wasn't entirely reversible. I made it back to my vehicle just as dawn was breaking through the canopy, painting the forest in soft golden light that seemed almost mundane after the otherworldly blue of those floating orbs. I sat in the driver's seat for a long time, staring at my hands and trying to convince myself that everything I'd experienced had been some kind of hallucination brought on by fatigue or altitude or a dozen other rational explanations. But when I finally started the engine and began driving home, I caught a glimpse of myself in the rearview mirror and nearly drove off the road. My reflection looked normal. Same face, same eyes, same tired expression I'd expected after a sleepless night in the forest. But there was something else there, something that shouldn't have been possible. Behind my reflection, superimposed like a double exposure photograph, was the faint outline of a blue orb, hovering just over my left shoulder. I blinked hard and looked again. The orb was gone, but the feeling of lightness remained, and I knew with absolute certainty that my midnight encounter in the Atlantic forest had marked the beginning of something, not the end. Now, 3 weeks later, I sit in my laboratory surrounded by botanical specimens and research notes, trying to document what happened that night. The lightness has grown stronger. Sometimes, when I'm not paying attention, I find myself floating an inch or two above my chair. My colleagues have started commenting on how I seem different, more ethereal, though they can't quite put their finger on what's changed. I've been back to the forest twice, searching for that rocky outcropping and its carved symbol. I've never been able to find it again. The trails I follow lead nowhere special, just deeper into ordinary wilderness where nothing supernatural waits in the shadows. But every night as I'm falling asleep, I can feel something calling to me from those dark woods. A gentle tugging sensation that promises freedom from the weight of existence, inviting me to return and complete what was started beside that ancient stone. And I'm terrified that one night I'm going to answer that call. Because the most frightening part isn't that I might be losing my mind. The most frightening part is that I might not be. That somewhere in the Atlantic forest, ancient forces still move through the darkness, collecting souls like fireflies in a jar, and I've been marked as their next acquisition. I keep telling myself it's all in my head, that trauma and exhaustion have created false memories and phantom sensations. But when I look in mirrors now, I sometimes see that blue light hovering just at the edge of my reflection, growing brighter each day. And I'm starting to understand that the next time I see those floating orbs in the forest, I might not have the strength to trace that spiral in reverse. I might not want to. After all, floating above the trees does sound peaceful, doesn't it? Story 5. The Strand Theater had been dead for 37 years, but something still breathed within its walls. I should have known better than to take the job. When Dad offered me $50 to help clean out the old cinema before the demolition crew arrived next month, I figured it was easy money. The place had been shuttered since 1987, collecting dust and memories in equal measure. What I hadn't expected was the weight of the silence. Not empty silence, but the kind that felt pregnant with whispers just beyond the range of hearing. The front lobby still held the ghost of butter and stale popcorn, though the concession stand had been stripped bare years ago. Faded movie posters hung at crooked angles, their corners curled like dying leaves. Casablanca, The Maltese Falcon, Double Indemnity, all the classics that had played here when the theater was in its prime during the 1940s. Dad had told me stories about how packed this place used to be, how couples would come for the late shows, how families would make it their Sunday tradition. He'd also mentioned, almost as an afterthought, some of the stranger stories. How sometimes, during the war years when husbands were overseas and mothers were working double shifts at the munitions factory, women would bring their babies to the late shows. The projectionist's booth was far enough back that crying wouldn't disturb other patrons much, and the constant mechanical hum of the film projector seemed to soothe fussy infants better than any lullaby. Most mothers came back for their children when the credits rolled. Most. I started with the main theater, working my way down the sloped floor with the industrial broom, stirring up decades of settled dust. The seats were still intact, red velvet that had faded to the color of dried blood, many torn and exposing their yellow foam innards. The screen hung like a massive blank eye, its white surface stained with water damage that created abstract patterns resembling faces in the dim light filtering through the emergency exits. It was when I reached row C that I first heard it. A soft sound, barely perceptible above the whisper of my broom, bristles against the carpet. At first, I thought it was the building settling, or maybe pipes creaking somewhere in the walls. But as I paused, letting the echo of my sweeping fade, the sound clarified into something that made my skin crawl. Crying. Soft, muffled, but unmistakably the sound of distress. I stood perfectly still, broom handle gripped in both hands, and listened. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, as if the theater itself was weeping. My rational mind immediately began cataloging explanations. Wind through broken seals, old pipes expanding and contracting, even cats that might have found their way inside through gaps in the foundation. But there was something about the rhythm of it, the cadence, that felt too human, too purposeful. The emergency lighting system, ancient and unreliable, chose that moment to flicker. For 3 rapid strobes, the theater was illuminated in harsh red intervals, and in those brief flashes, I thought I saw movement in my peripheral vision, small shapes darting between the seats, low to the ground, too quick to focus on directly. When the light steadied, I was alone again. I forced myself to continue sweeping, each stroke of the broom more deliberate than the last. The crying had stopped, but now I was hyper-aware of every sound: the creak of old wood, the distant hum of electrical systems, the way my own breathing seemed to echo in the cavernous space. Dust motes danced in the emergency lighting like tiny spirits, and I found myself tracking their movement with an intensity that bordered on obsession. That's when I felt the first tug. Something brushed against my leg, so light it might have been imagination, but insistent enough to make me step backward. I looked down to see nothing but shadows and the hem of my work coveralls, but the sensation lingered like the memory of touch. My hands were shaking as I gripped the broom tighter. I told myself it was just nerves, just the creepy atmosphere of the abandoned building getting to me. But deep down, I knew I was trying to convince myself of something that felt increasingly untrue. The second tug was stronger, more insistent. This time, I felt tiny fingers, or what my mind interpreted as fingers, grasping at the fabric of my coveralls near my hip. The sensation was so vivid, so impossibly real, that I spun around with the broom raised like a weapon. Nothing, just empty seats and shadows. But the crying had returned, and now it seemed to come from multiple sources. A chorus of soft distress that seemed to pulse with its own rhythm, rising and falling like a tide of sorrow. The emergency lights flickered again, and in those stuttering moments of red illumination, I saw them clearly for the first time. Small silhouettes moving through the aisles, too small to be adults, too purposeful to be animals. They moved with a fluid grace that defied physics, seeming to flow rather than walk, appearing and disappearing between the seats like memories made manifest. My throat felt dry as sandpaper as I tried to speak, to challenge whatever I was seeing, but no words came. Instead, I stood frozen as the temperature in the theater seemed to drop 10 degrees in as many seconds. My breath began to mist in the suddenly frigid air, and I could feel goosebumps rising along my arms despite the coveralls. The tugging became constant now, gentle but insistent pulls at my clothing, my shoelaces, even my hair. I felt surrounded by invisible presence, all seeking some kind of contact, some form of attention or comfort. The crying intensified, becoming less sorrowful and more desperate, as if my very presence had awakened something that had been waiting in the darkness for decades. I stumbled backward, dropping the broom with a clatter that seemed to reverberate through the theater like a gunshot. The sound triggered an immediate response. The crying stopped abruptly, as if every invisible presence had suddenly held its breath. In the silence that followed, I could hear my own heart hammering against my ribs. The emergency lights had stopped flickering, casting everything in their steady red glow, and for a moment, the theater felt completely empty again. Just me, alone with decades of dust and decay. Then I heard the voice. Not crying this time, but something that might have been words, spoken in a tone so soft and distant it could have been the wind. But there was no wind inside the sealed theater, and the syllables carried a cadence that suggested meaning, even if I couldn't make out individual words. The voice seemed to come from the direction of the screen, and as I turned toward it, I noticed something that made my blood turn to ice. The stains on the white surface, the water damage I'd dismissed earlier, were moving, shifting and flowing like ink in water, forming and reforming patterns that almost looked like faces. Dozens of them, small and round and infinitely sad. I closed my eyes hard, pressing my palms against my eyelids until I saw stars. When I opened them again, the stains were just stains, static and meaningless. But the feeling of being watched remained, stronger than ever. That's when I noticed the projectionist's booth. High above the seating area, the small window that had once housed the movie projector glowed with a faint amber light. It was impossible. The building had been without power for years, and I'd seen the electrical panels myself. They were corroded and dead. But there it was, a warm glow emanating from behind the glass, as if someone had just switched on the old equipment. As I stared, transfixed, a shadow moved across the window. Human-shaped, but somehow wrong in its proportions. too tall and thin to be natural. The shadow paused, and I had the distinct impression that whatever cast it was looking down at me. The tugging at my clothes became urgent now, almost frantic. I felt tiny hands, or the sensation of tiny hands, grasping at my coveralls from all directions, as if a dozen invisible presences were trying to get my attention simultaneously. The crying resumed, but now it sounded different. Less sorrowful, more pleading. My mind reeled as fragments of stories I'd heard came flooding back. Dad's offhand comments about babies left during late shows. Mrs. Patterson from down the street mentioning how her older sister used to work as an usher here, how she'd sometimes find forgotten items in the morning, bottles, blankets, sometimes even car seats. How the projectionist in the 1940s, old Mr. Heinrich, had developed a reputation for his kindness to struggling mothers, always willing to let them bring their children to the booth when they had nowhere else to go. How Mr. Heinrich had supposedly had a nervous breakdown in 1947 and spent the rest of his life in the state hospital, claiming he could still hear crying that never stopped. The amber light in the booth flickered, and for a moment, I could have sworn I saw the silhouette of someone operating the old projector, turning reels and adjusting focus with practiced efficiency. The mechanical sounds that accompanied the vision were impossibly clear. The whir of film threading through sprockets, the click of the advance mechanism, the low hum of the projection lamp. But there was no film to run, no audience to entertain, no reason for the machinery to operate except... The crying began to fade, becoming softer and more distant, as if whatever had been making the sound was moving away. The tugging at my clothes gentled, becoming almost affectionate, pat-like touches that felt disturbingly similar to how a small child might try to get attention from an adult. I realized I was no longer afraid. The terror that had gripped me moments before was being replaced by something else entirely, a profound sadness that seemed to emanate from the very walls of the theater. These weren't malevolent presences seeking to harm. They were lost things, forgotten things, seeking only the comfort that had been denied to them so long ago. The projectionist's booth went dark suddenly, as if someone had thrown a switch. The mechanical sound stopped, leaving only the whisper of my own breathing and the distant settling of the old building. But the tugging continued, gentler now, almost rhythmic, like rocking, like a lullaby, without music. I bent down slowly and picked up my broom, my movements careful and deliberate. As I resumed sweeping, I began to hum. Nothing specific, just a soft melody that seemed to come from somewhere deep in my memory. The kind of tune that might soothe a restless child. The kind that might help something find peace in the darkness. The touches at my clothing became less frequent, more tentative. The crying had stopped entirely, replaced by something that might have been contentment, or at least resignation. As I worked my way through the remaining rows, I felt the weight of invisible eyes upon me, but it no longer felt threatening. It felt grateful. When I finally finished and headed toward the exit, I paused at the lobby doors and looked back into the theater one last time. The emergency lights had stopped flickering, casting everything in their steady red glow. The seat sat empty and still. The screen was just a screen, stained but silent. But as I turned the handle and stepped into the dying light of evening, I could have sworn I heard it one more time. Not crying now, but something that might have been a whisper of thanks, carried on air that tasted of old popcorn and forgotten dreams. I locked the door behind me and walked to my car, trying not to think about the fact that I still felt tiny fingers brushing against my legs, or that the humming I'd started in the theater seemed to be continuing on its own, just at the edge of hearing. Dad called that night to ask how the cleaning had gone. I told him fine, that I'd be back tomorrow to finish up. I didn't mention the rest. But as I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling and listening to the familiar sounds of my house settling around me, I found myself humming again. The same soft melody, the same rhythm that had seemed to bring such peace to whatever lived in the darkness of the Strand Theater. And somewhere in the distance, carried on wind that shouldn't have been able to reach my second-floor bedroom, I could have sworn I heard the faint mechanical whir of a film projector, running its endless reels for an audience that existed only in the space between memory and forgetting. The demolition is scheduled for next month, but I've already told Dad I'll go back tomorrow to finish the job. Someone has to make sure they're not alone when the walls come down. Someone has to keep humming the lullaby until the very end. After all, some things shouldn't be forgotten, even if they were never quite real to begin with. Story 6. The pipes in my first apartment sang with a voice that wasn't quite human. At first I dismissed it as the building's age, a 1940s brick structure whose bones creaked with decades of settling and whose plumbing gurgled conversations between floors. But the sounds that crawled through the walls at 3 a.m. carried something more deliberate than random hydraulic protests. They carried my name, Marcus. The whisper would seep through the bathroom door like cold fog, rough and desiccated, as if spoken through a throat lined with sandpaper. I'd bolt upright in bed, heart hammering against my ribs, and listen to the silence that followed. A silence so complete, it felt like the building itself was holding its breath. Moving into apartment 4B had been a triumph of independence over circumstance. Fresh out of college, buried in student debt, I'd scraped together enough for the security deposit on this place through a combination of graduation money and 3 part-time jobs. The landlord, Mr. Kowalski, had seemed almost eager to rent it to me, his weathered hands shaking slightly as he'd handed over the keys. The unit itself was modest. A studio with a galley kitchen, a bathroom barely large enough for one person, and a single window that faced the building's inner courtyard. But it was mine, and after 4 years of dormitory life, the prospect of solitude felt like luxury. That luxury began to sour after the first week. The initial incident occurred on a Tuesday night. I'd fallen asleep to the distant hum of traffic on Madison Avenue when something pulled me from dreams like fingers closing around my consciousness. The apartment was dark except for the amber glow of streetlights filtering through the window blinds, casting prison bar shadows across the hardwood floor. Marcus. The sound had come from the bathroom, muffled but unmistakable. I lay still, listening to my pulse echo in my ears, waiting for logic to reassert itself. Old buildings made noise. Neighbors talked late. Sound traveled in unexpected ways through shared walls and common plumbing. But when I finally gathered the courage to investigate, I found the bathroom faucet running at full force, ice-cold water splashing against the porcelain basin. The single bare bulb above the mirror flickered in an irregular rhythm, like Morse code transmitting a message I couldn't decipher. I turned off the tap and flicked the light switch, but the bulb continued its erratic dance for several seconds before settling into steady illumination. My reflection stared back from the mirror, pale and wide-eyed, looking like a stranger I'd encountered in a recurring nightmare. The rational explanation seemed obvious. Faulty wiring, old plumbing, the building's infrastructure rebelling against decades of use. I made a mental note to call the landlord in the morning and return to bed, but sleep wouldn't come. Instead, I lay in the darkness listening to the building's night sounds, the distant flush of toilets, the whisper of air through heating vents, the soft percussion of footsteps in the apartment above. Somewhere in that symphony of urban white noise, I thought I heard my name again, so faint it might have been imagination. The pattern established itself over the following nights, always between 2 and 4 in the morning, always the same hoarse whisper, always followed by the bathroom faucet turning itself on, and the light beginning its cryptic flickering. I documented each incident in a notebook I kept beside my bed, recording times and details with the methodical precision of someone trying to solve a puzzle rather than confront a fear. After a week of interrupted sleep and increasingly frayed nerves, I decided to research the building's history. The local library's archives yielded a collection of newspaper clippings and city records that painted a picture of the Meridian Arms as a typical pre-war residential building with an unremarkable past. Built in 1943, it had housed a steady succession of working-class tenants, young professionals, and retirees over its 8 decades of existence. But buried in a police report from 18 months earlier, I found something that made my blood feel carbonated in my veins. Mrs. Eleanor Vance, 78, had been discovered in apartment 4B after neighbors complained about strange sounds and unpleasant odors coming from the unit. The report stated that she'd been alone in the apartment for an undetermined period, having apparently suffered what was described as a psychological episode brought on by severe isolation and depression. Neighbors reported hearing her calling out repeatedly, day and night, often addressing someone by name. The report didn't specify the name she'd been calling. Mrs. Vance had been removed to a psychiatric facility, but the report noted that she'd become increasingly agitated during transport, insisting that she needed to return to the apartment to continue waiting for someone. She'd apparently spent her final days in that same unit where I now lived, calling out to someone who never answered. That night, I lay in bed with every light in the apartment burning, the notebook open beside me, waiting. The whisper came at 3:17 a.m., clearer than it had ever been before. Marcus. This time, I forced myself to remain still and listen. The voice carried a quality I hadn't noticed before, a desperate urgency, as if the speaker was running out of time or breath or hope. It seemed to emanate not just from the bathroom but from the walls themselves, as if the building's skeleton had learned to speak. The faucet turned on with a violent rush of water, and the light began its frantic strobing. But now I heard something else. A rhythmic tapping, like fingernails against tile, coming from behind the bathroom wall. I sat up slowly, every muscle in my body tense with dread and fascination. The tapping followed a pattern. 3 quick beats, pause, 3 more, pause. It reminded me of someone knocking, trying to get attention from the other side of an insurmountable barrier. The notebook in my hands felt suddenly heavy. I flipped through the pages of meticulous observations, looking for patterns I might have missed. The times varied slightly, but the core elements remained constant. The whisper, the water, the light, and now this tapping that I was certain had been there all along, hidden beneath my fear and the apartment's ambient noise. Over the following days, I found myself studying the bathroom with the intensity of an archaeologist examining a dig site. The walls were covered in standard white ceramic tiles, most likely original to the building's construction. They showed the expected signs of age, hairline cracks here and there, slight discoloration around the fixtures, the accumulated patina of decades. But one tile, positioned at eye level beside the medicine cabinet, seemed different. The grout around its edges appeared newer, whiter than the surrounding lines. When I pressed against it, the tile gave slightly, as if it wasn't properly secured to the wall behind it. The revelation came to me gradually, like developing film in a darkroom. Mrs. Vance hadn't just been calling out to someone during her final days in the apartment. She'd been trying to communicate through the walls, perhaps convinced that someone on the other side could hear her. The loose tile might be evidence of her attempts to break through, to reach whoever she believed was waiting in the building's hidden spaces. The thought should have comforted me, a rational explanation for the apartment's strange acoustics and my sleep-deprived imaginings. Instead, it filled me with a dread so profound it felt like gravity pressing down on my chest. Because the voice in the night didn't sound like Mrs. Vance. It sounded like me. That realization struck me during another 3 a.m. visitation. As I lay in bed listening to the familiar progression of whisper, running water, and flickering light, I noticed something that made my skin feel 2 sizes too small. The voice calling my name carried the same cadence, the same inflection I used when talking to myself. It was as if someone had recorded me saying my own name and was playing it back through the building's acoustic system. I began to wonder if I was the one making the sounds. Perhaps the stress of living alone, combined with the pressure of student loans and an uncertain future, had triggered some form of sleepwalking or unconscious behavior. Maybe I was getting up in the night, turning on the faucet, manipulating the light switch, and calling out to myself in a voice my conscious mind didn't recognize. But that theory collapsed when I set up my phone to record the bedroom while I slept. The video showed me lying motionless in bed as the sounds began, my body clearly present and accounted for while the bathroom came alive with its nightly performance. The whispers grew more insistent as the weeks passed. What had started as a simple repetition of my name evolved into longer phrases, though the words remained frustratingly unclear. Sometimes they sounded like pleas, sometimes like warnings. The hoarse quality never changed, as if the speaker's throat had been damaged by too much use or too little moisture. Marcus, listen. Marcus, help. Marcus, understand. The messages, if that's what they were, seemed designed to pull me deeper into whatever mystery the apartment contained. I found myself spending increasingly long periods in the bathroom, pressing my ear against the walls, trying to locate the source of the sounds. The loose tile became an obsession. I could slide it slightly within its frame, revealing glimpses of the dark space behind it. One night, driven by exhaustion and desperate curiosity, I used a butter knife to work the tile completely free from the wall. Behind it lay a cavity that shouldn't have existed in the building's original construction, a hollow space between apartments, perhaps created during renovations or repairs over the decades. The cavity was larger than I'd expected, big enough for someone to crawl inside if they were determined enough. And scratched into the wall's surface, barely visible in the light from my phone's flashlight, were words etched with what might have been fingernails. Tell them I'm still here below that, in letters so faint they might have been imagined. Marcus, please listen. My hands shook as I held the phone, its LED beam dancing across the scratched plaster. The handwriting looked frantic, desperate, carved by someone who'd run out of conventional tools and resorted to whatever was available. But the messages weren't old. The scratches were too clean, too fresh-looking to have been made 18 months ago when Mrs. Vance had her breakdown. They looked like they'd been made recently. Very recently. I dropped the tile, and it shattered against the bathroom floor with a sound like bones breaking. The fragments scattered across the linoleum, and in their arrangement I thought I saw letters, words, messages written in the language of broken ceramic. The apartment fell silent then, not the normal quiet of night, but the absolute silence of held breath. Even the building's usual sounds ceased, as if every pipe and wire and heating duct had stopped functioning simultaneously. In that silence, I heard my own voice speaking words I wasn't saying. Thank you. The voice came from behind the wall, from inside the cavity I'd just exposed. It was my voice, but older, more tired, as if I'd been talking for months without rest. It carried a gratitude so profound it made my throat ache in sympathy. I backed away from the wall, leaving the broken tiles scattered across the floor, and returned to bed. But sleep wouldn't come. Instead, I lay in the darkness listening to the apartment's return to normal function, pipes gurgling, heaters cycling, the familiar sounds of a building full of life. The whispers stopped after that night. The bathroom faucet remained off, the light ceased its irregular flickering, and my sleep returned to the uninterrupted rhythm of someone who lived alone in a perfectly normal apartment. But sometimes, in the quiet moments between waking and sleep, I think about the voice behind the wall and the messages scratched into hidden plaster. I think about Mrs. Vance, alone in this same space, calling out to someone who might or might not have been there. I think about the space between apartments, the hollow places in buildings where voices might echo for longer than logic would suggest. And I wonder if the silence means I helped someone find peace, or if it means I've simply joined them in whatever place they were calling from. The line between rescue and imprisonment, I've learned, is thinner than the width of a ceramic tile. The cavity behind the bathroom wall remains open. I never replaced the tile I broke that night. Sometimes I catch myself standing in front of it, listening for sounds that don't come, waiting for messages that have already been delivered. In those moments, I'm never entirely certain which side of the wall I'm on. Story 7. The mall's fluorescent lights hummed their dying song as I guided the last stragglers toward the theater exit, my flashlight cutting through the dimness like a blade through velvet. 3 months working as an usher at premier cinemas, and the routine had become as predictable as the stale popcorn smell that clung to everything in this place. But tonight felt different, heavier somehow, as if the shadows between the seats had grown teeth. The last customer disappeared into the corridor, leaving me alone with 24 rows of empty chairs that seemed to lean inward like conspirators sharing secrets. I should have started my closing routine immediately. Check the bathrooms, sweep for forgotten belongings, lock the projector room. Instead, I found myself drawn to the VIP section, where legend had it that seat A14 was haunted. Every theater has its ghost stories, and Premier Cinemas was no exception. The other ushers whispered about the VIP phantom, supposedly some rich patron who'd had a heart attack during a midnight premiere years ago. Now his spirit lingered in the plush red leather seats, they claimed, growing restless whenever the theater sat empty. I'd always dismissed it as the kind of nonsense board employees invented to make minimum wage work seem more interesting. Tonight, however, boredom had made me cruel. I approached seat A14, its burgundy leather gleaming under the emergency lighting. The armrests were positioned slightly higher than the regular seats, and the cushioning was noticeably thicker. Even in death, the rich got better accommodations. "Hey there, Mr. VIP," I called out to the empty seat, my voice echoing off the sloped ceiling. "Hope you enjoyed tonight's show. Sorry about the sparse crowd. Guess nobody wants to watch pretentious art films on a Tuesday night." The silence that followed felt expectant, as if the theater itself was holding its breath. I waited, then laughed at my own foolishness. 3 months of this job was clearly getting to me if I was talking to furniture. "What's wrong?" I continued, emboldened by my own skepticism. "Feeling lonely up there in your fancy seat? Maybe if you'd been a nicer person when you were breathing, people would stick around to keep you company." I turned away, already planning to grab my cleaning supplies from the storage closet, when I heard it. A soft, mechanical whir, followed by a gentle thud. I spun around to find seat A14 slowly reclining backward, its footrest extending with the fluid motion of well-oiled machinery. My pulse quickened as I stared at the now reclined chair. Theater seats didn't recline on their own. They required deliberate pressure on the activation button, followed by sustained weight to keep them in position. Yet A14 sat there, fully extended, as if an invisible patron had just settled in for a long show. I approached cautiously, telling myself there had to be a rational explanation. Maybe the mechanism was faulty, maybe years of use had worn down the internal springs. I reached for the seat's side panel, intending to manually reset it, when the motion sensors along the entire VIP row suddenly blazed to life. Strip lighting illuminated the aisle in a cascade of white brilliance that hurt my eyes after the dimness. One by one, the sensors triggered down the row, A12, A10, A8, as if someone was walking deliberately from seat to seat, pausing at each one before moving on. But the aisle remained empty. No footsteps disturbed the silence. No shadow crossed the pools of light. My hand trembled as I fumbled for my radio. Protocol demanded I report any equipment malfunctions to the night manager. But how could I explain this? That the ghost I'd just mocked was apparently throwing a tantrum. "Maintenance issue in Theater 6. I managed to croak into the device, my voice smaller than I'd intended. "Motion sensors malfunctioning in the VIP section." The radio crackled back immediately. "Copy that, Jenkins. Electrical's been acting up all week. Just manually override the sensors and finish your rounds. I'll put in a work order for tomorrow." I clicked off, grateful for the manager's dismissive tone. At least someone in this building was still operating in the realm of logic and reason. I fumbled along the wall until I found the sensor override switch, and the blazing aisle lights winked out one by one. In the returning dimness, seat A14 remained stubbornly reclined. The walk to the bathroom felt longer than usual, my footsteps echoing strangely in the corridor. Premier Cinemas had been built in the early 90s, during the mall's prosperous years, and the architecture reflected that era's optimism about suburban entertainment. Wide hallways, soaring ceilings, and bold color schemes that had probably seemed cutting edge at the time, but now felt dated and slightly desperate. The men's restroom smelled of industrial disinfectant and something else. Something stale and organic that I couldn't quite identify. 2 of the 3 stalls had been out of order for weeks, their doors propped open to reveal broken fixtures and peeling paint. The third stall, the one closest to the wall, had a door that never quite latched properly. It hung slightly ajar, creating a gap just wide enough to make you feel watched. I was washing my hands when the trembling started. At first, I thought it was the building's ventilation system kicking in. Mall architecture was notorious for quirky airflow, and the restroom had always been drafty. But as I watched in the mirror, the broken stall door began to shake more violently, rattling against its frame with increasing intensity. The sound echoed off the tile walls like machine gun fire. I turned around slowly, water still dripping from my hands. The door's movement was too rhythmic to be random, too purposeful to be mechanical failure. It shook with the desperate urgency of someone trapped inside, someone pushing against the barrier with growing panic. "Hello?" I called out, though I could see through the gap that the stall was empty. My voice bounced back at me, distorted by the tile surfaces into something that sounded almost mocking. The shaking stopped immediately. I stood there for several heartbeats, listening to the building's ambient noise, the distant hum of the air conditioning, the occasional groan of settling steel, the whisper of air through ventilation ducts. All perfectly normal sounds for a large building at night. Nothing to suggest the presence of anything supernatural or threatening. But when I turned back to the sink to finish drying my hands, the shaking resumed with twice the intensity. I bolted from the restroom without looking back, my sneakers squeaking against the polished floor as I half ran toward the lobby. The sensation of being followed pressed against my shoulders like a physical weight, though every glance over my shoulder revealed only empty corridors and the red glow of exit signs. The lobby felt safer, with its floor-to-ceiling windows providing a view of the mall's central court. Security lights illuminated the fountain and the closed storefronts beyond, creating the illusion of life and activity even at this late hour. I collapsed into one of the leather chairs near the concession stand, trying to rationalize what I'd experienced. Equipment failures happened all the time in old buildings. Motion sensors were notoriously sensitive, triggered by everything from temperature changes to small animals. The seat could have been malfunctioning for weeks without anyone noticing. Who paid attention to empty chairs? And restroom doors were famous for their poor maintenance. A loose hinge, a warped frame, any number of structural issues could cause that kind of movement. I was reaching for my radio to report the bathroom door as another maintenance issue when the applause started. It began softly, barely audible over the building's ambient noise. A gentle pattering that could have been rain against windows or the settling of old pipes. But as I listened, the rhythm became unmistakable, the measured cadence of hands clapping in appreciation. The sound seemed to emanate from the theater itself, muffled by walls and distance, but unmistakably present. I stood up slowly, following the sound back toward Theater 6. The applause grew stronger as I approached, accompanied now by what sounded like satisfied murmurs and the rustle of movement. It was the sound of an audience responding to a performance, the kind of warm appreciation you heard at the end of a particularly moving film. But Theater 6 had been empty for over an hour. I pressed my ear to the door, and the sounds became crystal clear. Dozens of people were inside, clapping and shifting in their seats, creating that particular acoustic signature of a crowd in an enclosed space. I could even distinguish individual voices, someone clearing their throat, a woman's satisfied sigh, the creak of seat mechanisms as patrons prepared to leave. My hands shook as I fumbled with my key card. The magnetic lock disengaged with a soft beep, and I eased the door open just wide enough to peer inside. The theater was completely empty. Every seat sat in its upright position, exactly as I'd left them after the last customer departed. The emergency lighting cast its usual pale glow over the rows of burgundy fabric and chrome fixtures. No shadows moved between the aisles. No figures occupied the seats. Yet the applause continued, surrounding me now that I stood within the space, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. I stepped inside, letting the door close behind me, and the sound abruptly ceased. The silence that followed was absolute, not the comfortable quiet of an empty room, but the oppressive stillness of a held breath. I stood there for several minutes, waiting for my heart rate to return to normal, when I noticed movement in my peripheral vision. Seat A14 was slowly returning to its upright position. As I watched, the footrest retracted with that same mechanical whir I'd heard earlier, and the backrest straightened until the chair sat at attention like a soldier waiting for orders. But before I could process this fully, A12 began the same process. Then A10. One by one, chairs throughout the VIP section reclined and then returned to their normal positions, creating a wave of movement that rippled across the theater like dominoes falling in reverse. I backed toward the exit, my rational mind desperately trying to construct explanations, even as terror clawed at my chest. Maybe there was some kind of automatic reset function I didn't know about. Maybe the building's electrical system was having a massive failure that was triggering all the motorized components at once. Maybe I was having some kind of stress-induced breakdown, brought on by months of tedious work and irregular sleep schedules. But even as I cataloged these possibilities, I knew they felt hollow. Because somewhere, in the part of my mind that still believed in things that couldn't be explained by maintenance manuals or employee handbooks, I understood what was happening. The Phantom needed an audience. Over the following weeks, I began to notice patterns that I'd previously dismissed as coincidence. The supernatural activity seemed to correlate directly with the theater's occupancy levels. On busy nights, when all 6 theaters were full of chattering moviegoers, nothing unusual happened. The motion sensors behaved normally. The VIP seats remained stationary. Even the problematic bathroom door hung quietly in its frame. But on slow nights, when only a handful of customers scattered themselves across hundreds of available seats, the disturbances began almost immediately. Chairs would recline in empty sections. Motion sensors would trigger in perfect sequence along vacant aisles. And always, there was the sound of applause echoing from spaces that should have been silent. I started timing my breaks to coincide with the busiest periods, taking refuge in the noise and movement of actual customers. When families crowded into the lobby, arguing over which movie to see, I felt safe. When teenagers gathered around the arcade games, filling the space with electronic noise and laughter, the oppressive weight that had settled over my shoulders would lift. But as soon as the crowds thinned and silence crept back into the building, I could feel something stirring in the empty spaces. The other employees noticed my increasing nervousness, but attributed it to the stress of the job. Mall work had a high turnover rate for a reason, they reminded me. The weird hours, the repetitive tasks, the constant exposure to artificial lighting, it got to everyone eventually. Maybe I needed a vacation. Maybe I should consider finding work with more regular human interaction. But I couldn't tell them the truth, that I was beginning to understand the nature of the presence I'd awakened. It wasn't malevolent exactly. It wasn't trying to harm anyone or drive customers away. It was simply hungry, desperate for the energy that only a living audience could provide. And when that energy wasn't available naturally, it tried to create it artificially. The revelation came during a particularly slow Thursday night in November. I was doing my final sweep when I discovered that every single seat in Theater 3 had been arranged in the reclined position, not just the VIP section, but all 180 seats, creating the appearance of a fully occupied theater. The motion sensors along every aisle pulsed in slow, rhythmic waves, like a heartbeat made of light. But it was the sounds that truly chilled me. From within the empty theater came the full acoustic signature of a captivated audience. Not just applause this time, but the complete range of responses. Laughter at comedic moments, gasps during suspenseful scenes, the collective intake of breath at dramatic revelations. It was as if the Phantom had learned to simulate an entire crowd's emotional journey through a film. I stood in the doorway, listening to the ghost of an audience react to a movie that wasn't playing, and finally understood the scope of what I was dealing with. This wasn't just a spirit attached to a single seat or even a single theater. This was something that had bonded with the very concept of performance space itself, a presence that couldn't exist without the validation of an audience but had been trapped in a building where genuine audiences were becoming increasingly rare. And it was getting stronger. As winter deepened and mall traffic declined, the Phantom's attempts to fill the empty spaces became more elaborate. I would arrive for my shifts to find entire theaters arranged as if full houses were expected, lights dimmed to viewing levels, temperature adjusted for crowd comfort, even the concession areas somehow displaying evidence of recent activity, despite having been cleaned and secured the night before. The other staff members remained oblivious, arriving after the phantom had already withdrawn to wherever it retreated during busy periods. But I began staying later and later, partly out of fascination and partly out of a growing certainty that leaving the building unattended for too long would allow the presence to expand its influence beyond the theaters themselves. Because that's what it wanted, I realized during one particularly quiet evening in December. It didn't just want to fill empty seats with phantom patrons. It wanted to transform every vacant space in the building into a performance venue. I'd caught glimpses of its ambitions in the way motion sensors throughout the mall began triggering in coordinated patterns, in the way the fountain in the central court sometimes echoed with spectral applause, in the way even the employees-only areas seemed to hum with the expectant energy of a waiting audience. The phantom of seat A14 had never been content to haunt just one chair. It wanted to turn the entire mall into its stage, and every empty space into a seat waiting to be filled with the ghost of an audience that would never stop applauding. The question that kept me awake during my few hours of sleep was simple. How long could I keep it contained? How many nights could I spend as the sole barrier between a hungry spirit and a world full of empty spaces just waiting to be converted into theaters for an audience that existed only in the space between reality and nightmare? And more terrifying still, what would happen if I stopped showing up to work and there was no one left to witness whether the applause echoing through the empty building was real or imagined? The mall's lights dimmed automatically as closing time approached, and somewhere in the darkness, invisible hands began their eternal ovation for a performance that would never end. Story 8. The trailer creaked like old bones whenever the wind picked up, which it did most nights in this god-forsaken corner of nowhere. At 15, I'd grown accustomed to the symphony of metallic groans and the way the thin walls seemed to breathe with the desert gusts. What I hadn't expected was for the sounds to change, to develop a rhythm that felt almost conversational. It started 3 weeks ago when insomnia drove me deeper into the internet's forgotten corners than any teenager should venture. Past the surface web, past the obvious dark forums, into spaces that required passwords shared in whispers, and invitations that felt more like summons. The forum appeared innocuous enough, just another collection of urban legends and amateur occultism, but buried in a thread about forgotten rituals was something that made my sleep-deprived mind pause. The post was simple, almost mundane in its brevity. To summon the woman of lament, it read, you need only 3 white candles, a bowl of still water, and the patience to wait for her song. The instructions that followed were equally straightforward, almost disappointingly so. No elaborate circles, no ancient languages, no blood sacrifices. Just candles arranged in a triangle around a mirror's reflection captured in water, and a single phrase repeated 3 times, I offer my sleepless hours to your eternal watch. Boredom had become my constant companion since we'd moved to this isolated stretch of Arizona, where the nearest neighbor lived 2 miles away and cell service died with the sunset. Mom worked double shifts at the casino 40 minutes down the highway, leaving me alone with the desert's vast silence and the trailer's restless settling. The ritual seemed like harmless entertainment, a way to inject some manufactured mystery into the crushing mundanity of my existence. I gathered the materials easily enough. 3 pillar candles from Mom's emergency supplies, a mixing bowl filled with tap water. I positioned everything on the scarred linoleum floor of what generously passed for our living room, the candles casting trembling shadows against walls that had seen better decades. The water's surface captured their flames like tiny fallen stars, and I felt a strange anticipation building in my chest. The words came easily, rolling off my tongue with surprising familiarity. I offer my sleepless hours to your eternal watch. 3 times as instructed, each repetition seeming to deepen the silence that followed. I waited, expecting nothing, hoping for something, anything, to break the monotony. Nothing happened. I blew out the candles, dumped the water, and went to bed disappointed, but oddly restless. Sleep eluded me that night, as it had most nights since the move, but there was something different about the wakefulness. a quality to the darkness that felt occupied. The first sign came 2 nights later. I was lying in my narrow bed, staring at the ceiling and listening to the trailer's usual nocturnal complaints, when a new sound joined the familiar chorus. It was soft at first, barely distinguishable from the wind through the gap beneath my bedroom door. But as I focused on it, the sound resolved into something unmistakably human, a low, keening moan that seemed to originate from the hallway outside my room. My rational mind immediately provided explanations. The plumbing, a loose piece of siding catching the wind, the neighbor's dog, somehow carrying across the empty miles. But the sound had a distinctly female quality, a timbre that spoke of sorrow so profound it had taken on physical form. The moaning continued for perhaps 10 minutes before fading, leaving me questioning whether I'd heard anything at all. I convinced myself it was a dream, that half-awake state where imagination bleeds into reality. But the next night, it returned. This time, I worked up the courage to investigate. I slipped from my bed and crept to the door, pressing my ear against the thin wood. The sound was definitely coming from the hallway, a wandering, aimless lamentation that seemed to drift from room to room like smoke seeking escape. I turned the handle slowly, wincing at the inevitable click, and peered into the narrow corridor that connected our trailer's modest rooms. Nothing, just shadows and the familiar clutter of a life squeezed into too small a space. But the moaning continued, now seemingly emanating from the living room. I followed it on bare feet, my heart hammering against my ribs, only to find empty space and silence that felt somehow smug. Over the following week, the pattern established itself with increasing boldness. The woman of lament, for I'd begun thinking of her in those terms, would begin her nightly vigil around midnight, her voice carrying through the trailer's thin walls like water through a sieve. She never appeared when I searched for her, but her presence became as real as the furniture, as constant as the desert wind. Then she began to speak. Not to me directly, but in a continuous monologue that painted pictures of tragedies that felt familiar yet impossible. She spoke of children who fell through ice that had never formed on lakes that didn't exist, of car crashes on roads that led nowhere, of houses that burned with cold flames. Her stories were elaborate, detailed, and completely fabricated, yet told with such conviction that I found myself checking local news sites, searching for evidence of disasters that existed only in her imagination. The more I tried to ignore her, the more persistent she became. The moaning gave way to full conversations with invisible companions, detailed discussions of sorrows that multiplied like reflections in facing mirrors. She would describe funerals for people who had never lived, memorial services for tragedies that had never occurred, grief so pure and manufactured it felt like a parody of genuine emotion. Sleep became impossible. I would lie in my bed, listening to her elaborate fantasies of woe, and feel something fundamental shifting in my perception of reality. The boundaries between her fictional tragedies and my own life began to blur. I caught myself mourning for the imaginary victims of her stories, feeling genuine sadness for scenarios that existed only in the space between her voice and my increasingly fragile mind. It was during the 3rd week that I first saw her shadow. I was stumbling to the kitchen for another cup of coffee. I'd been drinking it by the pot to combat the exhaustion, when movement in my peripheral vision made me freeze. There, cast against the hallway wall by no visible source, was the silhouette of a woman. She stood perfectly still, as if waiting for acknowledgement, her outline wavering like heat shimmer despite the desert's nighttime chill. I turned to face the shadow directly, but found only empty air. The shadow remained, however, as if its owner existed in some parallel space that intersected with our world only in reflection. I reached out tentatively, expecting my hand to disrupt the impossible projection, but the shadow persisted unchanged. That night, her stories took on a new urgency. She spoke of a young man trapped in a desert trailer, slowly losing his grip on reality as an entity fed on his sleeplessness. The tale was told with her usual dramatic flair, complete with detailed descriptions of his growing paranoia and the way his mother would find him one morning, catatonic and staring at empty corners. The story was too close, too specific. I tried to convince myself it was coincidence, that my exhausted mind was imposing patterns where none existed. But the fear that had been building in my chest crystallized into something sharper, more urgent. The next evening she appeared in full. I was sitting at our small kitchen table, surrounded by empty coffee cups and the remains of a meal I couldn't remember eating, when she materialized in the doorway. Not gradually, not like a fading photograph developing in reverse, but suddenly and completely, as if she had always been there, and I was just now learning to see. She was exactly as I'd imagined and nothing like I'd expected. Tall and pale, wearing a dress that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. She possessed the kind of beauty that suggested tragedy was her natural habitat. Her eyes held depths that spoke of endless sorrow, but her expression was almost hopeful. She didn't speak, not with her voice anyway. Instead, her presence filled the trailer with such overwhelming melancholy that I felt my own emotions being slowly displaced, replaced by griefs that weren't mine to carry. I understood, without words, that she was lonely, that the ritual hadn't summoned her so much as opened a door she'd been waiting eons for someone to unlock. She wanted companionship, someone to share the weight of her fictional tragedies. Each night she would pour her imaginary sorrows into whatever vessel she could find, and I had foolishly made myself available. But the arrangement was killing me, if not literally, then in every way that mattered. I had to find her someone else. The realization came with startling clarity, cutting through the fog of exhaustion that had clouded my thoughts for weeks. She wasn't malevolent, just needy. Like a spiritual refugee seeking asylum in whatever consciousness would accept her. But I was too young, too inexperienced to serve as her eternal confessor. I needed to redirect her attention before my sanity became the price of her companionship. The solution presented itself during my desperate return to the forum where this had all begun. Buried in the same thread, posted by a different user with a timestamp from just 3 days ago, was a message that made my blood chill. Successfully passed the woman to my older brother. Poor bastard didn't know what hit him. 5 years of peace, finally. Others had dealt with her before. Others had found ways to transfer her attention, to redirect her hungry need for someone to hear her endless catalog of imaginary woes. The thread contained fragments of methodology, hints at rituals of transference that required specific conditions and careful timing. But there was a problem. The ritual required a willing participant, someone who would knowingly accept her presence. And everyone I knew lived too far away, was too young, or would think I'd lost my mind completely. Then I remembered Marcus. Marcus was Mom's ex-boyfriend, a man in his 30s who'd stuck around longer than most and had always been decent to me. He lived alone in a larger trailer about 10 miles down the highway. And more importantly, he was currently going through a messy divorce that had left him insomniac and desperate for any kind of distraction. The plan formed with the clarity of desperation. I would invite Marcus over, ostensibly to help fix some fictional problem with our plumbing. While he was here, I would perform the transference ritual described in the forum, a variation of the original summoning that redirected the woman's attention to the nearest willing consciousness. But first, I had to make him willing. I called Marcus that afternoon, affecting the kind of teenager in crisis voice that usually prompted immediate adult response. I explained that Mom was working late, and our hot water heater was making terrible noises, that I was afraid it might explode or flood the trailer. Could he come take a look? He arrived just after sunset, tool bag in hand, and genuine concern etched on his weathered face. I led him to the narrow hallway, where our ancient water heater crouched like a metallic troll, making sounds that were partly mechanical and partly supernatural. As he knelt to examine the connections, I began the ritual. The words came more easily this time, as if they'd been waiting on my tongue for weeks. I whispered them under my breath while Marcus worked, focusing my intention on transferring the woman's attachment from myself to him. The air in the hallway grew thick, oppressive, and I felt something fundamental shifting in the spiritual geography of the trailer. Marcus paused in his work, tilting his head as if listening to a sound only he could hear. His expression shifted from concentration to confusion, then to something approaching fear. "Do you hear that?" he asked, his voice strangely subdued. I nodded, relief flooding through me as I realized the transference was working. "It's been going on for weeks," I said, allowing genuine exhaustion to color my words. "Mom thinks it's just the plumbing, but—" I didn't need to finish. Marcus was already hearing her, the soft, exploratory moaning that marked the beginning of the woman's nightly routine. His eyes widened as he recognized the distinctly human quality of the sound, the way it seemed to drift through walls as if the trailer's architecture was merely a suggestion. "We should call someone," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. He was already being drawn in, already feeling the pull of her need for an audience. I left him there, listening to her song, and retreated to my bedroom with a lightness I hadn't felt in weeks. For the first time since performing the original ritual, I slept deeply and dreamlessly, undisturbed by fictional tragedies or imaginary grief. But 3 days later, my phone rang. Marcus's voice was strained, desperate. He spoke of sleepless nights and constant crying, of a presence that filled his trailer with sorrows that weren't his own. He begged me to come over, to help him understand what was happening. I told him I was sick, that I couldn't leave the house. But really, I was terrified. Not of the woman, she was Marcus's problem now, but of what his call implied. Because if Marcus was experiencing what I'd experienced, if the woman had successfully transferred her attention to him, then why was I still hearing footsteps in our hallway at night? Why did shadows still move without casting objects? Why did I sometimes catch glimpses of a pale figure standing at the edge of my vision, wearing a dress that absorbed light and eyes that held impossible depths? The horrifying possibility crept through my mind like ice water. What if the ritual hadn't transferred her attention but simply expanded it? What if, instead of moving from me to Marcus, she had learned to be in multiple places at once? What if I hadn't solved my problem but created 2 new ones, doubling her presence instead of relocating it? Or worse, what if there had always been more than one woman of lament, and the ritual didn't summon a single entity, but opened a door to an entire community of grief-hungry spirits? What if Marcus and I were now both hosting our own personal tragedians, each with their own catalog of fictional sorrows to share? The questions multiply in my mind like reflections in facing mirrors, each possibility more disturbing than the last. I lie awake at night, listening to the familiar sounds of my own woman as she begins her nightly routine, and I wonder how many other people are performing the ritual right now, opening doors they don't understand to entities they can't control. The forum post has been deleted, the thread has vanished. But somewhere out there, in other isolated places where boredom and desperation intersect, I imagine other 15-year-olds are discovering that some doors, once opened, can never truly be closed. The desert wind picks up outside, and the trailer begins its familiar song of creaking metal and settling dreams. But underneath it all, threading through the familiar sounds like smoke through cracks, I hear her voice beginning tonight's catalog of sorrows that never were. And in the distance, carried on the wind from the direction of Marcus's trailer, I hear another voice joining hers in perfect, terrible harmony. The woman of lament has learned to multiply her loneliness, and I'm beginning to understand that I might have done something far worse than summon a spirit. I might have taught her how to spread. Story 9. The renovation had been a godsend for the Paramount Cinema, breathing life into what had been slowly dying since the multiplex opened across town. Fresh carpet in burgundy and gold, reupholstered seats with cup holders, and most importantly, new lighting throughout every theater. Well, almost every theater. Theater 3 had other plans. I'd been working at the Paramount for 8 years, long enough to know every creak in the floorboards and which bathroom stalls had locks that actually worked. When Mr. Hendricks promoted me to head maintenance after the renovation, I thought I'd finally caught a break. The pay bump was modest, but the responsibility felt good. Made me feel like I belonged somewhere, like I was building something that mattered. The first sign of trouble came 3 weeks after reopening. The new LED fixtures had been installed throughout the building, Energy efficient, long-lasting, bright enough to make the lobby feel alive again. Every theater had been upgraded except Theater 3, where the old incandescent bulb in the center aisle light kept burning out. Not just burning out, exploding. The first replacement lasted 2 days. The second, less than a day. By the fourth bulb, I started paying closer attention. The socket seemed fine, no signs of electrical issues or loose connections. The voltage was correct, but every time I screwed in a new bulb, something felt wrong. Not wrong in a way I could explain to Mr. Hendricks or write up in a maintenance report. Wrong in the way shadows fall differently when you're alone in a house, or the way silence can feel heavy with presence. It started with pressure. Not quite resistance, but something that made my hand hesitate as I twisted the bulb into place, like working against a gentle but persistent current. The kind of sensation that makes you second-guess yourself, wondering if you're imagining things because you're tired or stressed or maybe drinking too much coffee. The fifth bulb lasted exactly 37 minutes. I know because I was in the lobby when it popped, the sound echoing through the theater like a gunshot. Mr. Hendricks was showing a potential investor around, talking about our improved amenities and growing customer base. The sound made them both jump. Must be a power surge, I explained, already dreading another trip to the supply closet. But there hadn't been a power surge. I checked the electrical panel, tested the voltage, even called an electrician who charged us $200 to confirm what I already knew. Nothing was wrong with the wiring. That's when I started noticing other things. The way Theater 3 felt colder than the other screens, even with the HVAC running perfectly. How conversations seemed to die when staff walked past that particular doorway, as if sound itself grew timid in that space. The way my tools would be arranged differently after I left them unattended, always in neat little rows that I definitely hadn't made. By the sixth bulb, I was convinced someone was playing a prank. Maybe Rodriguez from concessions, who still resented that I'd gotten the promotion instead of his cousin. Or Sarah from the box office, who had a weird sense of humor and too much time on her hands during slow matinee shifts. I decided to wait and watch. That evening, after the last show ended and the rest of the staff had gone home, I positioned myself in the projection booth overlooking Theater 3. The old building settled around me with familiar sounds, the ventilation system cycling, pipes ticking as they cooled, the distant hum of the exit sign transformers. I'd brought a thermos of coffee and a flashlight, planning to catch whoever was messing with my lights. At 11:47 p.m., the bulb went out. Not popped, not exploded, just went dark, as if someone had flipped a switch. I trained my flashlight on the fixture from the booth window. Nothing moved. No one entered or exited the theater. The emergency lighting along the aisles provided enough illumination to see that the space was empty, just rows of burgundy seats facing a blank screen. But something had changed. The air itself felt different, thicker somehow, like the moment before a thunderstorm when the pressure drops and your ears pop. I found myself holding my breath without meaning to, every instinct screaming that I was no longer alone. The scratching started then, soft at first, barely audible over the building's ambient noise, like fingernails on fabric, or maybe something small moving through the walls. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, echoing off the theater's surfaces in a way that made it impossible to pinpoint the source. I waited until morning to check on the bulb. The fixture was empty, not just burned out, gone. The bulb had been completely removed, set carefully on the armrest of the nearest seat like someone had unscrewed it by hand. No broken glass, no sign of damage, just an empty socket and a perfectly intact 60-watt incandescent bulb sitting where a patron might have left their drink. That's when I started talking to it. "Look," I said to the empty theater, feeling foolish but also strangely compelled. "I don't know what your deal is, but I've got a job to do here. These lights need to work." The scratching sound returned, softer now, almost contemplative. "How about this?" I continued, setting the bulb back on the armrest where I'd found it. "I'll leave this fixture dark, just this one. But you stay in here, all right? Don't cause problems in the other theaters." The sound stopped. The oppressive feeling in the air seemed to lift slightly, though the temperature remained cold. I waited 5 minutes, Then 10. Nothing. No pressure against my hand, no mysterious equipment rearrangements, no sounds from the walls. "Do we have a deal?" I asked the darkness. Silence. But it felt like acceptance. For 3 months, the arrangement worked perfectly. Theater 3 remained dimmer than the others, but customers adapted. A few complained about the ambiance, but most seemed to prefer the moodier lighting for horror films and date nights. Mr. Hendricks noticed the reduced maintenance costs and started talking about implementing atmospheric lighting design in other screens. I began to think of the presence as a tenant, someone who'd been displaced by the renovation maybe, and just wanted a corner of the building to call home. It seemed reasonable enough. The Paramount was old, built in 1952, according to the cornerstone, and old buildings accumulated history like dust. If something wanted to live quietly in Theater 3, causing no real harm, who was I to object? I even found myself talking to it occasionally during my evening rounds. Nothing elaborate, just casual observations about the day's events or comments about upcoming film bookings. The tenant never responded directly, but the atmosphere in the theater would shift subtly, becoming more welcoming when I approached with respect and growing tense when I was rushed or irritated. Then corporate decided to relocate our family programming. The memo came down on a Tuesday morning. All G and PG-rated films would be moved to Theater 3, effective immediately. Something about optimizing the customer experience and creating dedicated spaces for different demographics. The decision had apparently been made at the regional level, no room for discussion or appeal. I tried to explain to Mr. Hendricks that Theater 3 had technical issues that made it unsuitable for certain types of programming. He listened with the patient expression of someone humoring a subordinate's quirks. "The lighting situation is under control," he said. "Corporate specifically requested that theater because it's our smallest screen. Better for intimate showings." Intimate showings. I wanted to laugh, but the sound died in my throat as I imagined families with young children settling into those burgundy seats, unaware of what shared the space with them. The first family film was scheduled for that Saturday's matinee. I spent Friday evening in Theater 3, trying to renegotiate the terms of our arrangement. "You've got to understand," I explained to the darkness. "Things are changing. There's going to be different types of people in here now. Families. Kids, probably." The temperature dropped noticeably. The scratching sound returned, more agitated than I'd ever heard it. "I know it's not ideal, but maybe you could just stay quiet. Keep things normal until we figure something else out." The emergency lighting flickered. Once, twice, then steady again. "I'm trying to work with you here, but you've got to meet me halfway." Something moved in my peripheral vision. Not a person or object, but a shift in the shadows themselves, like darkness condensing into a more purposeful shape. The scratching became a grinding sound, metal on stone, setting my teeth on edge. "Please," I said, and meant it. "Just give me some time to figure this out." The sound stopped abruptly. The temperature remained cold, but the oppressive feeling subsided enough for me to breathe normally again. Saturday's showing went smoothly. Animated adventure film, decent crowd, no complaints. I monitored Theater 3 closely throughout the day, checking the fixture every hour. The bulb stayed dark, but nothing else seemed amiss. Sunday brought the second family screening, another animated feature. Again, everything appeared normal. I started to think maybe the tenant was more reasonable than I'd given it credit for. Monday morning, I discovered the darkness had spread. The hallway leading to Theater 3 felt different. Colder, like stepping into a walk-in freezer. The overhead fluorescents flickered intermittently, casting shifting shadows that seemed to move independently of their sources. Staff members complained about feeling watched when they passed that section of the building, though none could explain exactly why. Tuesday, the darkness reached the lobby. Customers began commenting on cold spots near the concession stand. The popcorn machine, which had been working perfectly since the renovation, started producing kernels that tasted stale and bitter. Sarah reported that several patrons had asked about The Man in Theater 3 during evening showings, though our records showed those screenings had been sparsely attended. Wednesday, Mr. Hendricks called me into his office. We've been getting complaints, he said, sorting through a stack of customer feedback forms. People saying they feel uncomfortable in the building, that it feels wrong somehow. I kept my expression neutral. Any specific issues I can address? Temperature inconsistencies, lighting problems, and this? He held up a comment card. Customer says they heard scratching sounds during the 7 p.m. showing in Theater 3, like something was trying to get out of the walls. The scratching had never happened during active screenings before. That was new. That was escalation. I'll check the HVAC system, I offered. Maybe some ductwork came loose. Do that. And Jerry, I need you to fix whatever's going on with the lighting situation. Corporate's breathing down my neck about the customer satisfaction scores. That evening, I returned to Theater 3 for another conversation with my tenant. The space felt different now, larger somehow, as if the walls had receded into shadow. The familiar burgundy seats looked darker, almost black in the dim emergency lighting. This wasn't our deal, I said to the emptiness. You agreed to stay in this theater. The scratching began immediately, aggressive and demanding. It seemed to come from every surface at once. The walls, the ceiling, the floor beneath my feet. The sound of something trying to claw its way out. People are starting to notice. If this keeps up, they'll bring in specialists, investigators, maybe shut down this section entirely. The grinding sound returned, louder now, like metal being dragged across concrete. The temperature plummeted until I could see my breath in the emergency lighting. What do you want? I asked, though I was beginning to suspect I already knew. The sound stopped. In the sudden silence, I heard something I'd never noticed before. Breathing that wasn't my own. Slow, measured, patient. The sound of something waiting. You want the whole building, don't you? I whispered. The breathing continued, steady and calm. Satisfied. I understood then that I'd never been negotiating with a displaced spirit or harmless building ghost. I'd been making deals with something that had been waiting decades for the right moment to expand beyond its boundaries. The renovation hadn't disturbed it. It had freed it, given it an excuse to test the limits of its domain. And I'd helped. Every accommodation, every compromise, every moment of treating it like a reasonable entity had been feeding its growing confidence. I'd taught it that humans could be negotiated with, manipulated, convinced to accept its presence as normal. Thursday brought reports of cold spots throughout the building. The projectionist in Theater 1 complained that his equipment kept malfunctioning, displaying images that weren't in the source material, shadowy figures moving through frame, faces in the background that hadn't been there during previous showings. Friday, customers started asking for refunds, not because of anything specific, but because of a general sense of unease that made them want to leave. Business dropped by 30%. Saturday, I found the first message, written in dust across the glass of the lobby display case, finger-height letters spelling out a single word, more. I cleaned it immediately, but by evening it had returned. Same location, same message, but darker this time, as if pressed deeper into the glass. Sunday morning brought 3 more messages, scattered throughout the building. More in the men's restroom mirror, more traced across the concession stand counter, more spelled out in spilled popcorn kernels near the box office. Mr. Hendricks called an emergency staff meeting. I don't know what kind of prank this is, he announced to the assembled employees, but it stops now. Anyone caught defacing property will be terminated immediately. I looked around the room at my co-workers, Sarah from box office, Rodriguez from concessions, Mike the projectionist, Jenny who handled evening cleaning. All of them looked genuinely confused by the accusations. None of them seemed capable of orchestrating the subtle campaign of unease that had been building throughout the week. Because it wasn't them. It was my tenant, growing bolder and more demanding with each passing day. That night I stayed late again, but this time I wasn't planning to negotiate. I was planning to understand exactly what I'd been dealing with. Theater 3 was completely dark when I entered, emergency lighting somehow dim to barely visible. The burgundy seats had taken on a deep red color that reminded me unpleasantly of dried blood. The air felt thick enough to swim through, heavy with presence and intention. I know you can hear me, I said to the darkness. I know you understand what I'm saying. So let's be clear about something. This ends here. No more spreading through the building. No more messages. No more scaring customers. The breathing sound returned, closer now, as if something were standing just behind my shoulder. I fought the urge to turn around. I'm serious. Whatever you are, wherever you came from, this is as far as it goes. The scratching began again, but different this time. More rhythmic, more purposeful, like something writing or drawing or carving symbols into surfaces I couldn't see. The emergency lighting flickered and went out completely. In the absolute darkness, I heard my own voice speaking words I hadn't chosen to say. The building remembers everything. Every conversation, every compromise, every moment of fear, feeding what waits in the spaces between walls. You opened the door when you chose accommodation over confrontation. Now the door won't close. I tried to move, to speak, to do anything under my own control, but my body felt distant and unresponsive. The voice continued, using my throat but not my thoughts. Renovations disturb more than dust and old wiring. They wake things that have been sleeping in forgotten corners, dreaming of expansion and influence. You gave permission through your reasonable negotiations and logical accommodations. You taught patience and strategy when brute force would have failed. The lighting returned gradually, revealing that I was no longer alone in Theater 3. The burgundy seats were filled with shadowy figures, indistinct but definitely present, all facing forward, as if watching a screening. In the projection booth window, I could see my own silhouette, but the movements weren't matching what I intended to do. The messages will continue, my voice said without my permission. The cold spots will spread. The discomfort will grow until accommodation becomes the only reasonable choice, until the whole building agrees to share space with its older residents. Control returned to me suddenly, like stepping out of a cold current into warm water. I stumbled backward, gasping, my own voice harsh in my throat. The shadowy figures in the seats turned toward me in perfect unison, a motion that suggested vast coordination and purpose. Not individual spirits or random hauntings, but something organized and deliberate that had been using Theater 3 as a staging ground for a much larger operation. I ran. The next morning, I submitted my resignation. Mr. Hendricks tried to convince me to stay, offering a small raise and more flexible scheduling, but I couldn't explain that my tenant had never been confined to Theater 3 at all. It had been growing throughout the building for months, learning how to manipulate both the environment and the people within it. My negotiations had simply provided it with information about human psychology and management structures. 6 months later, I read in the local paper that the Paramount Cinema had closed permanently due to ongoing maintenance issues and declining customer satisfaction. The building sold to a development company that planned to convert it into office space. I wonder sometimes if the new tenants will notice the cold spots, or hear scratching sounds in the walls, or find messages written in dust across their computer screens. I wonder if they'll try to negotiate when the presence starts making reasonable requests for small accommodations. But mostly, I try not to think about Theater 3 at all, or about the night when I realized that some problems can't be solved through compromise and understanding. Some things grow stronger when you acknowledge their existence, feeding on attention and legitimacy until they become too large and organized to contain. The Paramount is gone now, demolished last month to make way for modern construction. But sometimes, when I drive past the empty lot, I can see my breath despite the warm weather, and I hear the sound of breathing that isn't my own. The darkness has to go somewhere, after all, and it's had months to learn how buildings work, how people think, how to make itself indispensable through patient negotiation and reasonable accommodation. I just hope whoever moves into the new construction doesn't try to fix problems that seem manageable through conversation and compromise. Some tenants never really leave. They just find better buildings. Story 10. The USS Mercy cuts through Pacific waters like a floating tomb, her white hull gleaming under surgical lights that never dim. I should have known that joining the Navy to escape my past would only trap me in something worse. The recruiter never mentioned that some ships carry more than the living. I enlisted 3 months after Sarah left, when the walls of our apartment began closing in, and every corner held accusations. The Navy promised structure, purpose, a clean break from civilian failures. What they delivered was assignment to a hospital ship where the line between healing and haunting blurs like watercolors in rain. The Mercy houses 800 souls, though I've begun questioning what constitutes a soul aboard this vessel. Medical personnel drift through corridors with the purposeful quiet of those accustomed to suffering. The smell never leaves you. Antiseptic, mixed with something metallic that might be blood or might be the sea itself, corroding everything it touches. My bunk sits in the enlisted quarters, port side, third level down from the main deck. The bulkheads sweat constantly, creating rivulets that trace irregular patterns like veins beneath translucent skin. At night, when the ship rolls with the rhythm of distant storms, those water trails catch the emergency lighting and pulse with a heartbeat all their own. I met Elena Vasquez during my second week aboard. She materialized in the ship's small recreation room while I hunched over a jigsaw puzzle, trying to piece together a lighthouse that seemed determined to remain fragmented. Her approach was silent, professional, but when she spoke, her voice carried warmth that the Mercy's steel corridors had long since forgotten. "You're the new quartermaster," she said, settling into the chair across from me. Her uniform was immaculate, the red cross on her cap catching overhead fluorescence. "I'm Elena, head nurse, surgical ward." I nodded, fighting the urge to stare. Elena possessed the kind of beauty that belonged in old photographs, timeless, slightly faded around the edges, as if she'd stepped from a different era entirely. Her dark hair was pinned back with military precision, but a few strands had escaped to frame her face. When she smiled, something in my chest loosened for the first time since boarding. "I have a favor to ask," she continued, leaning forward conspiratorially. "There's a box of old photographs in my quarters, family pictures mostly. They've been damaged by humidity, and I heard you worked in photo restoration before enlisting." The admission surprised me. I hadn't told anyone about my previous career, the small studio where I'd brought faded memories back to life with patience and chemistry. That life felt like something that had happened to someone else, in a world where colors existed beyond institutional green and antiseptic white. "I could take a look," I offered, grateful for any distraction from the monotony of inventory logs and supply requisitions. Elena's smile widened, transforming her face completely. "Meet me at my quarters tomorrow evening after dinner shift. Compartment C47. She left me there with my broken lighthouse, but for the first time since boarding, the puzzle pieces seemed eager to fit together. Elena's quarters were larger than standard enlisted accommodations, a privilege of rank that afforded her a porthole overlooking the ship's wake. The small space was meticulously organized, personal items arranged with the same precision she brought to her medical duties. A small shelf held books on naval history and surgical techniques, their spines worn from frequent handling. The photograph collection sat in a weather-beaten wooden box that looked far older than anything that should exist aboard a ship commissioned in 1987. Elena handled it with reverence, her fingers tracing the carved initials on the lid, EVM, before lifting it open. "These belong to my grandmother," she explained, carefully removing a stack of black and white photographs. "She served as a nurse during World War II, aboard the first USS Mercy, the hospital ship, not the current one." I accepted the photos with professional care, immediately noting the damage. Moisture had created blooming stains across most images, and several showed signs of chemical degradation that would require delicate restoration work. But even through the damage, I could make out Elena's grandmother. The resemblance was unmistakable. The same luminous smile, the same way of holding her shoulders. "I'll need to work on these in the ship's photo lab," I said, studying a particularly damaged image that showed her grandmother standing beside what appeared to be an operating table. "It might take several sessions." "Take all the time you need," Elena replied, her hand briefly touching my arm. The contact sent an unexpected warmth through my system, a sensation I'd almost forgotten existed. I began the restoration work the following evening, setting up in the ship's small photography lab normally used for documenting medical procedures. The facility was well equipped, but felt somehow wrong after hours, the enlarger casting strange shadows that moved independently of my movements. The first photograph came to life slowly under careful chemical treatment. Elena's grandmother emerged from the damage like a figure stepping out of fog, her nurse's uniform crisp and white against the industrial background of what was clearly the original Mercy's surgical ward. But as the image clarified, I noticed something disturbing. Behind Elena's grandmother, partially obscured by the photographic damage I'd initially attributed to age and moisture, stood additional figures. They were indistinct, their faces blurred as if they'd moved during the exposure, but their postures suggested medical personnel, surgeons perhaps, based on their positioning around what appeared to be surgical equipment. I attributed the anomaly to double exposure, or camera shake, and continued working. But as I restored subsequent photographs, the same phenomenon appeared repeatedly. In every image, regardless of setting or apparent time period, ghostly figures lurked behind Elena's grandmother, always positioned just outside clear focus, always suggesting medical activity. The pattern was too consistent for photographic accident. Either someone had deliberately manipulated these images, or something had consistently interfered with their proper exposure. Neither explanation sat comfortably in my mind. I worked late into the night, losing track of time as image after image revealed the same disturbing backdrop. Elena's grandmother smiled radiantly in every photograph, but the shadowy figures behind her seemed to grow more defined with each restored image, as if my restoration process was somehow calling them into clearer existence. When I finally returned to my quarters near midnight, exhaustion weighed on me like a physical presence. The corridor leading to my bunk felt longer than usual, the overhead lighting casting unusual shadows that seemed to flicker at the edges of my vision. I chalked the sensation up to eye strain in the late hour, but sleep, when it came, brought no relief. I jerked awake to the sound of mechanical humming directly above my bunk. The overhead lights were rotating slowly, their housings turned to cast focused beams downward like examination lamps in an operating theater. The illumination was surgical in its intensity, creating a spotlight that seemed designed to pin me in place. Around me, my bunkmates slept undisturbed, their breathing steady and unaware. The mechanical sound continued, a soft whirring that suggested motors engaging, gears turning with purpose. But when I reached up to touch the light fixture, my fingers found only standard fluorescent housing, cool and motionless. I lay back down, heart hammering against my ribs, and tried to convince myself that fatigue and eye strain were creating hallucinations. The explanation felt hollow, even as I formed it. But what alternative existed? Naval vessels were mechanical environments where unusual sounds carried logical explanations. The whispers began on the third night. I was drifting between consciousness and sleep when voices penetrated the darkness around my bunk. The words were medical in nature, spoken with the crisp authority of surgical personnel conducting preoperative briefings. "Patient presents with acute psychological displacement," came the first voice, gender indeterminate but carrying the weight of professional experience. "Recommend immediate intervention." "Prep for exploratory procedure," responded another voice, this one definitely male and tinged with an accent I couldn't place. "Standard protocol. Incision at 0400 hours. Subject has been chemically prepared," added a third voice, female and somehow familiar. "All systems are optimal for extraction." I lay frozen in my bunk, every muscle tensed as the voices continued their clinical discussion. They seemed to emanate from the space directly above me, as if invisible medical personnel were conducting rounds just beyond the steel ceiling. The conversation was too detailed, too specific to be products of imagination, yet no rational explanation existed for their presence. "Recovery time estimated at 72 hours, the first voice continued. "Post-operative monitoring will be continuous." "Confirm patient identity," requested the male voice. A pause. Then the familiar female voice responded with my full name, service number, and medical history. Information that should have been secure, locked away in official files accessible only to authorized personnel. The consultation continued for perhaps 10 minutes before fading gradually, as if the invisible medical team was moving away down a corridor that existed in some parallel dimension. I remained motionless until dawn, afraid that any movement might signal my awareness and somehow make me a more attractive candidate for whatever procedure they were planning. Elena found me in the mess hall the next morning, where I sat staring at untouched coffee and trying to reconcile the night's events with anything resembling sanity. She approached with her characteristic grace, sliding into the seat across from me with a look of genuine concern. "You look terrible," she observed, though her voice held more warmth than criticism. "Are you feeling all right?" I wanted to tell her everything: the photographs, the lights, the voices. But how could I explain that I'd been selected for surgery by personnel who might not exist, based on conversations that violated every principle of medical privacy? The words would sound like the ravings of someone losing their grip on reality. "Just tired," I managed, wrapping my hands around the coffee mug for its warmth. "Working late on the photo restoration." Elena's expression brightened. "How is that progressing? I'm eager to see what you've been able to recover." "There are some unusual elements in the images," I said carefully. "Photographic anomalies that I'm trying to understand." She leaned forward, her dark eyes intense with interest. "What kind of anomalies?" "Additional figures in the background. They appear in every photograph, but they're not clearly focused, as if something was interfering with the camera's ability to capture them properly." Elena was quiet for a long moment, her gaze distant. When she spoke again, her voice carried a weight I hadn't heard before. "My grandmother used to tell stories about the original Mercy," she said slowly, "about surgical procedures that continued even after the war ended. She claimed that some of the medical staff never really left the ship, that they kept working even after." She trailed off, shaking her head. "Family folklore, the kind of stories that grow larger with each telling." But something in her tone suggested she gave those stories more credence than she was willing to admit. I found myself studying her face, searching for signs of deception or hidden knowledge. The expression I found there was complex, part concern, part understanding, and something else I couldn't quite identify. "I should get back to the restoration work," I said, standing abruptly. The need to understand what was happening had become urgent, driven by a growing certainty that the voices and lights were connected to the photographs in ways I didn't yet comprehend. Elena nodded, but as I turned to leave, she called my name softly. When I looked back, her face held an expression of profound sadness. "Be careful," she said simply. "Some things are better left undisturbed." I spent the afternoon in the photography lab, working with renewed intensity on the damaged images. As each photograph emerged from the chemical baths, the background figures became clearer, their forms more defined. What I saw challenged every rational explanation I could construct. The figures wore surgical attire from different time periods. Some appeared to be dressed in World War II-era medical uniforms, while others wore clothing that seemed to predate even that conflict. They surrounded Elena's grandmother in every image, but their attention wasn't focused on her. Instead, they seemed to be looking directly at the camera, or more accurately, directly at whoever might be viewing the photograph. As the images clarified, I began to recognize facial features among the ghostly medical staff. Several of the figures appeared repeatedly across different photographs, suggesting these weren't random photographic accidents, but consistent presences that had somehow imprinted themselves onto the film. The final photograph in the collection was the most disturbing. It showed Elena's grandmother standing in what was clearly a modern operating theater, far more advanced than anything that should have existed during World War II. Behind her, the ghostly figures were more clearly defined than in any previous image, their faces sharp with surgical focus. But it was the patient on the operating table that made my hands tremble as I held the photograph. Though the face was partially obscured by surgical draping, enough features were visible to confirm my growing suspicion. The patient was me. I stared at the impossible image until my eyes burned, searching for signs of photographic manipulation or darkroom error. But the technical quality was flawless, the chemical processing perfect. Either someone had created an incredibly sophisticated fake, or I was looking at documentary evidence of an event that hadn't yet occurred. The photograph slipped from my fingers and fluttered to the laboratory floor. As it landed face up, The overhead lights began their slow rotation, transforming from standard illumination into focused surgical spotlights. The mechanical humming filled the small space, growing louder with each revolution. I grabbed the photograph and fled the laboratory, my footsteps echoing through corridors that seemed longer and more maze-like than I remembered. The need to find Elena had become overwhelming, driven by questions that demanded immediate answers. Her quarters were empty when I arrived, but the door stood slightly ajar. I knocked and received no response, then pushed the door open and called her name. The space was exactly as I remembered it, except for one crucial detail. The wooden box that had contained the photographs was gone. I searched her quarters thoroughly, checking every possible hiding place. The box had vanished completely, as if it had never existed. But the restoration chemicals on my hands still carried the faint smell of developing solution, and the final photograph remained clutched in my grip as physical proof that something extraordinary was happening. The realization hit me with devastating clarity. Elena had known exactly what the photographs contained when she asked me to restore them. The restoration process itself had been the purpose, not the recovery of family memories. By bringing the images into sharper focus, I had somehow strengthened whatever connection existed between the ghostly medical staff and our current reality. I was not a coincidental victim, but a specifically chosen participant in something that transcended normal understanding of cause and effect. The voices I'd been hearing weren't planning future surgery. They were preparing for a procedure that had already been documented in a photograph that shouldn't exist. The mechanical humming had followed me from the laboratory, growing stronger as I stood in Elena's quarters. The overhead lighting began its slow rotation, casting moving shadows that suggested figures just beyond the edge of perception. The temperature in the small space dropped noticeably, creating the antiseptic chill of an operating theater prepared for surgery. I needed to find Elena and demand explanations, but first I had to protect myself from whatever was coming. The photograph in my hand felt warm, almost alive, as if the image it contained was somehow drawing energy from my presence. If restoring the images had strengthened the connection between past and present, then destroying them might sever it entirely. The thought of destroying the photographs filled me with unexpected resistance. They were beautiful work, technically perfect restorations that represented hours of careful craftsmanship. But the alternative was participating in a surgical procedure conducted by medical personnel who might exist outside normal physical reality. I made my way to the ship's deck, where Pacific wind cut through the thick air of enclosed spaces. The ocean stretched endlessly in all directions, dark water that could swallow evidence without question. The restored photographs could disappear forever, taking their impossible documentation with them. But as I stood at the railing, preparing to cast the images into the waves, Elena appeared beside me with the silent approach that had characterized our first meeting. "You found the final photograph," she said, her voice carrying neither surprise nor apology. I turned to face her, still clutching the images against the wind. "You knew what I would find. You knew what those photographs contained before you asked me to restore them." Elena's expression was complex, mixing sadness with something that might have been relief. "I hoped you would understand, that you would see what my grandmother saw, what she tried to document all those years ago." "Understand what?" I demanded, though part of me already knew the answer. "The original Mercy was more than a hospital ship," she explained, her voice barely audible above the wind. "It was a place where the boundaries between life and medical intervention became fluid. The surgical staff there developed techniques that went beyond conventional healing. And you think those techniques are still being practiced? By people who died decades ago?" Elena was quiet for a long moment, studying my face with the same intensity she'd shown during our first conversation. "I don't think they died," she said finally. "I think they transcended death, found a way to continue their work regardless of physical limitations." The wind gusted harder, threatening to tear the photographs from my grip. Elena stepped closer, her presence somehow providing warmth against the Pacific chill. "They've chosen you for a reason," she continued. "The restoration work, the way you brought their images into clearer focus, it demonstrated a connection to their purpose that they found valuable. I won't participate in some phantom surgery, I said, backing away from her. Whatever they're planning, I won't be part of it. Elena's expression shifted to something that might have been pity. It's not about what you will or won't participate in. The procedure is already scheduled, already documented. You saw the evidence yourself. I held up the photograph showing me on the operating table. This is impossible. This hasn't happened yet. Time isn't as linear as we pretend, Elena replied, especially aboard ships that have seen as much medical intervention as the Mercy. Some events exist independently of our perception of sequence. The mechanical humming had grown audible even over the wind, emanating from the ship's superstructure, like the sound of massive gears engaging. Emergency lighting began flashing in patterns that suggested surgical preparation, and from deep within the ship came the faint sound of medical equipment being wheeled into position. You can fight it, Elena said, moving closer again. But fighting will only make the procedure more difficult for everyone involved. My grandmother tried to resist once. The surgical team was very understanding, very patient. They simply waited until she was ready to cooperate. I looked out at the dark Pacific, then back at Elena. Your grandmother. She's been gone for decades. She completed her service aboard the original Mercy in 1943, Elena confirmed. But she never really left. None of them did. The realization struck me like physical impact. Elena wasn't requesting help with photograph restoration or sharing family history. She was serving as liaison between the current medical staff and the surgical team that had never abandoned their duties. Her role was to identify suitable candidates and prepare them for procedures that defied conventional understanding of medical practice. The photographs were bait, I said, understanding flooding through me. You knew I couldn't resist the technical challenge. The photographs were invitation, Elena corrected gently. An opportunity to demonstrate your suitability for advanced medical intervention. Your restoration work proved that you could bridge the gap between different states of existence. Around us, the ship was transforming. Lighting shifted from standard naval illumination to the focused brightness of surgical theaters. The deck beneath our feet vibrated with the rhythm of equipment being activated, and from below came the sound of voices conducting final preparations. I could throw the photographs overboard and run, but Elena's words suggested that the surgical team's patience was infinite. If the procedure had already been documented, if time aboard this ship followed rules different from conventional reality, then my choices might be far more limited than I wanted to believe. What kind of procedure? I asked, surprised by the steadiness of my own voice. Elena's smile returned, warm and somehow comforting. Exploratory. They want to understand how contemporary consciousness interfaces with their enhanced techniques. You'll be contributing to medical knowledge that spans multiple generations. And afterward? You'll remember everything clearly. More clearly than you've ever remembered anything. The procedure enhances perception in ways that civilian consciousness can't achieve independently. The wind had died completely, leaving us in the strange calm that sometimes precedes significant weather changes. The photographs in my hand had grown warm, their surfaces seeming to pulse with energy that synchronized with my heartbeat. From deep within the ship came a new sound, surgical instruments being arranged with the precision of ritual preparation. The voices were closer now, conducting their professional consultation with increasing urgency. Patient preparation is complete, came the familiar female voice, though now I understood it wasn't coming from invisible speakers but from Elena herself, her mouth moving slightly as she channeled communications from the surgical team. Recommend immediate transport to Theater 7, added the male voice, again spoken through Elena's lips, though the words clearly originated elsewhere. I understood then that my choice had already been made, possibly before I'd ever set foot aboard the Mercy. The restoration work, Elena's appearance in my life, even my decision to enlist, all had been elements in a larger pattern designed to bring me to this moment. The photographs slipped from my fingers and scattered across the deck, their restored images catching the surgical lighting as they danced in the still air. But instead of blowing overboard, they began moving purposefully toward the nearest hatch, as if drawn by magnetism toward the operating theaters below. Elena took my arm gently, her touch warm and reassuring, despite everything I now understood about her true nature. "Shall we go?" she asked, though the question felt more like courtesy than genuine inquiry. As we moved toward the ship's interior, I caught a final glimpse of the photographs arranging themselves in neat stacks beside the hatch, ready to document whatever was about to occur. The mechanical humming had resolved into the familiar rhythm of surgical equipment cycling through startup procedures, and the voices had grown clear enough to distinguish individual speakers, each one professional, experienced, and absolutely dedicated to their craft. The corridor leading below deck stretched longer than I remembered, lined with surgical lighting that cast no shadows. Elena walked beside me with the measured pace of someone escorting a patient to a procedure they genuinely believed would be beneficial. Her presence was comforting, even knowing what I now knew about her role in events. "Will it hurt?" I asked as we descended toward Theater 7. Elena considered the question seriously. "Sensation will be different afterward, more complete. What you currently interpret as pain may become something else entirely." We paused at a set of double doors marked with symbols I didn't recognize, though somehow I understood they indicated surgical territory. Beyond the doors, I could hear the sounds of final preparation, equipment being tested, instruments being arranged, voices coordinating with the efficiency of long practice. "Are you ready?" Elena asked, her hand still warm on my arm. I looked back toward the stairway we'd descended, then forward toward the doors that would admit me to whatever lay beyond conventional medical experience. The choice felt both inevitable and somehow liberating. An end to uncertainty, if not exactly the end I'd expected when I enlisted. "I'm ready," I said, and meant it. Elena smiled and pushed open the doors, revealing a surgical theater that existed somewhere between past and present, where time folded in on itself, and healing took forms that civilian consciousness could barely comprehend. The photographs had arrived ahead of us, arranged on a side table like case studies waiting to be referenced during the procedure. As I stepped across the threshold, the last thing I noticed was my own face looking back at me from the final restored photograph. Calm, curious, and somehow relieved to finally understand my place in the larger pattern that connected all medical intervention across time and space aboard the USS Mercy. The doors closed behind us with the soft whisper of air seals engaging, and somewhere in the distance, a ship's bell marked the beginning of the 0400 watch. Story 11. The fluorescent lights above aisle 3 had been flickering for 6 months, casting intermittent shadows across the probiotic yogurt display. I'd grown accustomed to their irregular rhythm during my overnight shifts at Quick Stop, the way they seemed to pulse with my heartbeat when the store fell into its deepest quiet. 3 a.m. always brought the strangest customers, but none stranger than the man who appeared every Tuesday night, precisely at 3:17, to purchase a single container of Greek yogurt with an expired rewards card. His routine never varied. Tall, thin frame draped in a gray windbreaker that seemed too large for his shoulders. He moved through the store with deliberate steps, avoiding eye contact with the security cameras, his pale fingers selecting the same brand every time, Probio Plus, strawberry flavor. At the register, he'd slide a cracked plastic rewards card through the scanner, wait for the inevitable beep of denial, then pay an exact change from a zippered coin purse that had seen better decades. I never questioned it. Night shift clerks learn not to question anything that doesn't involve theft or violence. The man was quiet, polite in his wordless efficiency, and gone within 4 minutes of arrival. His presence became as routine as checking the coffee pots or restocking the energy drinks. Just another ghost haunting the fluorescent purgatory of late-night retail. The first sign something had shifted came on a particularly humid Tuesday in September. The man arrived at his usual time, selected his yogurt, approached the counter. But when he produced his rewards card, I noticed his fingernails. They were longer than before, yellowed at the edges, and as he slid the card through the scanner, I caught a glimpse of something underneath. The plastic was hollow, transparent as a window, completely empty inside. The scanner beeped its familiar denial. The man's lips twitched upward, just slightly, as if this sound brought him some private satisfaction. He paid his usual exact change and left. But something lingered in the air afterward. A faint smell like spoiled milk mixed with copper pennies. I told myself I'd imagined the transparency of the card. The overnight shift played tricks on perception. Every veteran knew that. The brain, starved of natural light and human interaction, began creating patterns where none existed. I'd seen cashiers become convinced that certain products moved themselves, that security cameras tracked customers who weren't there, that the automated checkout voices whispered personal secrets after midnight. I wasn't going to become another casualty of fluorescent madness. But the following Tuesday, he returned with the bottle. This time, his approach felt different. He moved slower, each step deliberate and measured, like someone walking through water. The gray windbreaker hung even looser on his frame, and I noticed for the first time that his face seemed somehow undefined, as if viewed through frosted glass. He carried a clear plastic bottle, unmarked and empty, clutched against his chest like a prayer book. At the yogurt display, he stood motionless for nearly 10 minutes. I watched through the convex security mirror, noting how the fluorescent light seemed to bend strangely around his silhouette. When he finally selected his usual container, he set it down and began to pour its contents into the bottle. The thick pink liquid moved with an unnatural consistency, too slow for yogurt, too fast for something that should have been refrigerated for hours. He approached my register with the empty yogurt container and the filled bottle. His eyes, when they finally met mine, were the color of old receipts, bleached and faded. He attempted to scan the empty container's barcode, and when my system registered the theft, he smiled. "There seems to be a pricing error," he said, his voice like paper being torn. "I believe you need to correct this. Sir, you can't just pour out the product and correct it." The word hung in the air between us, heavy with implications I couldn't name. His grip on the bottle tightened, and I noticed the zipper on his windbreaker was open, revealing nothing but darkness underneath. Not clothing, not skin, just an absence that seemed to pull light into itself. "I can't do that, sir. You'll need to pay for the full product." He studied me for a long moment, his head tilted at an angle that made my neck ache in sympathy. Then he reached into that dark opening beneath his jacket and produced exact change, counting it out coin by coin onto the counter. Each piece of metal struck the surface with a sound like breaking glass. "Next time," he said, sliding the coins toward me, "the price will be different." After he left, I stood frozen at the register for what felt like hours. The smell lingered, spoiled milk and copper pennies, but stronger now, mixed with something that reminded me of my own sweat. I found myself checking and rechecking the cash drawer, counting the same bills and coins repeatedly, unable to shake the feeling that something had been taken that couldn't be tallied. When my shift ended at 6 a.m., I drove home through empty streets with my mirrors adjusted wrong, constantly checking for headlights that never appeared. The next Tuesday, he didn't come. I told myself I was relieved, but as 3:17 approached and passed without his arrival, anxiety crept through my chest like cold water. I walked the aisles, straightening products that didn't need straightening, checking expiration dates I'd verified hours earlier. The fluorescent lights in aisle 3 had stopped flickering altogether, casting everything in stark, unforgiving clarity. At 3:45, I found the bottle. It sat on the shelf where the ProBio Plus yogurt belonged, transparent and empty, reflecting the overhead lights like a prism. I approached slowly, my footsteps echoing strangely in the empty store. As I reached for it, I noticed something that made my hand freeze in midair. The bottle contained a liquid, despite appearing empty. When I tilted my head, I could see it. A thin layer of something that moved when the bottle moved, coating the interior like condensation. It was the color of old receipts. I left it there and returned to the register, but throughout the remaining hours of my shift, I felt compelled to check on it. Each time I walked down aisle 3, the bottle had moved, never dramatically, just a few inches to the left or right, always maintaining its position among the yogurt containers, but never in exactly the same spot. By morning, it was gone. The pattern continued for 3 weeks. No customer on Tuesday nights, but always the bottle, appearing in different sections of the store. Pet food, cleaning supplies, over-the-counter medications, each time containing that strange, nearly invisible liquid. Each time gone by morning. I began timing my walks through the store, documenting the bottle's locations in a notebook I kept hidden beneath the register. The movements followed no logical pattern, but they felt purposeful, as if the bottle was exploring, learning the geography of Quickstop's 24 aisles. During my documentation, I started noticing other things. The security cameras in certain sections would track movement when I knew the store was empty. The automatic doors would slide open for no apparent reason, letting in warm night air that carried that familiar smell of spoiled milk and copper. The cash register would occasionally display transaction amounts for products that hadn't been scanned, always in exact denominations that matched the change the man had left weeks earlier. But it was the mirrors that disturbed me most. Quickstop used convex security mirrors at the end of each aisle, positioned to give me clear sightlines from the register. During those late October nights, I began catching glimpses of movement in the mirrors that didn't correspond to anything in my direct vision. A figure pushing a shopping cart through aisles I could see were empty. The sound of wheels rolling across linoleum when I knew I was alone. I'd rush to investigate, my sneakers squeaking against the freshly waxed floor, but the aisles were always empty. Yet the mirrors continued showing that figure, always just at the edge of my peripheral vision, always pushing that cart with deliberate, measured steps. One Thursday night, not a Tuesday, which felt significant, I positioned myself at the register with a clear view of both aisle 3 and its corresponding mirror. The bottle sat among the yogurt containers, that strange liquid visible only when I looked at it sideways. I watched for 2 hours, my eyes moving between the shelf and its reflection. At exactly 3:17 a.m., the figure appeared in the mirror. It moved with the familiar gait of the Tuesday night customer, pushing an empty cart through aisle 3. But when I looked directly at the aisle, I saw nothing. The mirror showed the figure stop at the yogurt display, reach for the bottle, and pour its contents into something I couldn't see. The bottle disappeared from both the shelf and the mirror simultaneously. Then the figure in the mirror turned toward me. Even through the distortion of the convex glass, I recognized the face. It was mine. Not similar to mine, not like someone who might be related to me. It was my face, wearing my expression of confusion and growing terror, framed by my exact hairline and eyebrows. The mirror me raised one hand in a wave, smiled with my own smile, and mouthed words I could lip-read with intimate familiarity. Pricing error. I ran, not toward the aisle to investigate, not to the phone to call police or management or anyone who might help me make sense of what I'd seen. I ran toward the back office, slamming the door behind me and turning every lock I could find. Through the small window, I watched the empty store for the remainder of my shift, too terrified to venture back onto the floor. When my replacement arrived at 6 a.m., I mumbled something about feeling sick and left through the rear exit. In my car, I adjusted the rearview mirror and stared at my own reflection for 20 minutes, searching for some sign that what I'd seen wasn't real. But my face looked back at me with complete normalcy. Tired eyes, stubbled cheeks, the small scar above my left eyebrow from a childhood accident, everything exactly as it should be. I called in sick for the rest of the week. But sickness pay doesn't cover rent, and by the following Tuesday I was back behind the register, convinced I'd experienced some kind of breakdown brought on by too many overnight shifts and too little sleep. Night work was known to cause hallucinations, paranoid episodes, temporary psychotic breaks. I'd read about it online during my week of absence, finding comfort in medical explanations for supernatural experiences. The store felt different when I returned, cleaner somehow, as if it had been thoroughly sanitized in my absence. The fluorescent lights in aisle 3 had been replaced, casting everything in steady, bright illumination. The convex mirrors gleamed like they'd been polished by professional cleaners. At 3:17 a.m. he returned. This time he looked exactly like me. Not similar. Not like a distant relative or someone who shared certain features. He was me, down to the small scar above his left eyebrow, wearing clothes identical to mine. He moved through the store with my gait, selected a container of ProBio Plus yogurt with my exact hand movements, and approached the register carrying my posture and expression. When he reached the counter, he produced the familiar rewards card, still cracked, still transparently empty, and attempted to scan it. The system beeped its denial, and he looked up at me with my own eyes. "Pricing error," he said, using my voice with perfect intonation. "You need to correct this." I stared at my own face looking back at me, my own lips forming words I hadn't spoken. The smell of spoiled milk and copper pennies filled the air between us, but underneath it was something new. The scent of my own deodorant, my own shampoo, my own particular mixture of coffee breath and nervous sweat. "I know what you are," I whispered. "Do you?" He tilted his head, my head, at that familiar, aching angle. "What am I?" "You feed on shame. You take the shape of whoever you feed from." He smiled my smile, but his teeth were the color of old receipts. "And what have you been ashamed of? Working here night after night, watching people buy products you can't afford, serving customers whose lives you'll never understand? How long have you hated this job, this uniform, this reflection in the convex mirrors?" I couldn't answer because he was right. Every night for 2 years, I'd stood behind this register feeling diminished, reduced to a function rather than a person. Every customer who'd looked through me rather than at me had taken something, left me a little less substantial than before. "Your credit is overdrawn," he continued, reaching beneath his jacket, my jacket, into that darkness I now recognized as the space where shame lived. "But I can correct the balance. Let me take over from here. You've paid enough." The offer hung in the air like spoiled milk and copper pennies. Behind him, I could see the security mirrors reflecting dozens of figures that looked exactly like me, all pushing empty carts through empty aisles, all waiting for my answer. I reached beneath the register for the notebook where I documented the bottle's movements, but my hand found something else instead. A rewards card, cracked and transparently empty, that definitely hadn't been there before. Outside, dawn was breaking over the parking lot, but the fluorescent lights inside seemed to be growing dimmer, as if something was drawing their power into itself. In aisle 3, I could see dozens of bottles now, all containing that strange liquid the color of old receipts. The man, who was me, who was feeding on me, who might have always been me, extended his hand across the counter. "The transaction is simple," he said. "You give me your shame, and I give you relief. Your credit history will be clean." I looked at my own face offering my own destruction, and realized I couldn't tell which one of us was real anymore. The mirrors showed hundreds of me now, all standing behind registers in identical stores, all serving customers who looked exactly like us. The rewards card in my hand felt warm, as if it had been carrying heat from another person's fingers. Outside, the first customers of the day were beginning to arrive. Story 12. The fluorescent lights above the concession stand hummed with that particular frequency that seemed to burrow straight into my skull. 3 weeks into my job at the Meridian Multiplex, and I still hadn't gotten used to the sound. During training, when Mr. Harrison asked if I scared easily, I'd laughed, real confident, like I had any idea what I was walking into. The theater had that end-of-shift stillness that felt different from ordinary quiet. It was the kind of silence that pressed against your eardrums, thick and expectant. I moved through my closing routine with mechanical precision, checking each auditorium, collecting the abandoned popcorn containers that somehow always multiplied during the final credits, wiping down the sticky floors that would be sticky again by tomorrow night. Theater 7 was my last stop. The largest screen in the building, it had hosted the final showing of some forgettable action sequel. The credits had rolled hours ago, but the massive screen still held that faint afterglow that expensive projection equipment never quite lost. I gathered the scattered napkins and empty cups, my footsteps echoing against the sloped floor. That's when I heard it. The popcorn machine in the lobby had started up again. The familiar whir of the kettle motor, the gentle rattle of kernels against heated metal. I froze, plastic cups still clutched in my hands. I'd turned that machine off myself 20 minutes ago. Cleaned it even. Scrubbed the oil residue from the kettle until my reflection stared back at me from the polished surface. I told myself it was an electrical quirk. Old buildings had their personalities, their little mechanical hiccups. But as I climbed the steps toward the exit, the smell of fresh popcorn began to fill the air. That warm, butter-laden aroma that usually felt welcoming now seemed wrong, almost cloying. The lobby was dark except for the emergency lighting and the soft glow emanating from behind the concession counter. The popcorn machine's heat lamps cast everything in an amber wash that made the shadows seem deeper, more substantial. Steam rose from the kettle in lazy spirals, and I could hear the kernels popping in their steady rhythm. I reached for the power switch, my hand trembling slightly. The machine was hot, properly hot, as if it had been running for hours. As I flipped the switch, the motor died with a reluctant wheeze, but the screen above Theater 7 suddenly blazed to life. My breath caught. The massive display filled with brilliant white light, so bright I had to shield my eyes. When my vision adjusted, I saw it. A silhouette. Enormous. Impossibly tall, standing at what appeared to be the center of the screen. The figure held something in its hands, something large and round that could have been a bucket. I ran toward the projection booth, taking the stairs 2 at a time. My keycard slipped twice before I managed to swipe it properly, my palms slick with sudden sweat. The booth was empty, all the equipment powered down. The computer monitors were black, the projectors cold and silent, but the screen below still glowed. I stared through the booth's window at the impossible image. The silhouette hadn't moved, but now I could make out more details. The figure's arms were too long, its shoulders too broad, and that bucket, it wasn't a bucket at all. It was some kind of container, wide-mouthed and deep. Then it spoke. The voice came from everywhere and nowhere, a whisper that seemed to originate from inside my own skull. "Can I take your shell now?" I slammed my hand on the main power cutoff, plunging the entire lobby into darkness. The screen died instantly, leaving only the green glow of the exit signs and the distant hum of the ventilation system. But even in the absolute darkness, even with no power feeding the projection system, I could still see the silhouette. It stood there, patient and waiting, outlined against a screen that should have been black. My phone's flashlight beam shook as I aimed it at the screen. The light passed right through the figure, illuminating nothing but blank white surface. But when I lowered the phone, the shadow returned, solid and undeniable. I ran. The next morning, I found myself researching the Meridian's history during my break. The theater had opened in 1987, built on the site of an old warehouse. Nothing particularly sinister in its past. No murders, no tragedies. Just 35 years of showing movies and selling overpriced snacks. But the employee turnover was interesting. In the past 3 years alone, 17 people had quit or been fired. That seemed high for a place that employed maybe 25 people total. I started asking around, casual questions about former coworkers. Sarah, who worked the evening shift at concessions, mentioned that people didn't usually give notice. "They just stopped showing up," she told me, refilling the candy dispensers. "One day they're here, next day they're gone. Management doesn't talk about it much." I pressed for details, but Sarah just shrugged. People moved on, found better jobs, went back to school. Normal reasons for normal departures. Nothing unusual about any of it, except for the photographs. I noticed them during my 3rd week, while cleaning the glass cases that displayed movie posters and promotional materials. The concession counter had a large mirror behind it, angled to help employees spot shoplifters. But in certain lighting, especially during the late shifts, the glass reflected more than just the lobby. Faces, dozens of them, layered like double-exposed film. They appeared in the curved surface of the popcorn maker's glass front, subtle and easily dismissed as tricks of the light. But once I started looking, really looking, I couldn't stop seeing them. They were always there during closing time, when the lights were dimmed and the lobby took on that end-of-day atmosphere. Young faces, mostly, the kind of people who worked part-time theater jobs. Their expressions were uniform, a look of dawning realization, as if they'd just understood something terrible. I started taking photos with my phone, trying to capture what I was seeing. But the camera only showed normal reflections, the expected interplay of light and shadow. The faces existed in some space between reality and perception, visible only to the naked eye and only under specific conditions. The voice came again 3 nights later. I was alone in Theater 3, collecting the debris from the evening showings, when the lights began to dim. Not the normal, gradual dimming of the house lights between shows, but something else, a creeping darkness that seemed to emanate from the screen itself. "The shells pile up," the voice whispered, and I could feel the words against my skin like a cold breath. So many shells, all hollow inside. I dropped the trash bag I'd been carrying and backed toward the exit. The screen began to glow with that same impossible light, and the silhouette appeared again, closer this time, as if it had moved down from its distant position. "Yours is almost ready," it continued, and the figure raised its container higher. "Such a pretty shell. It'll look perfect with the others." I ran again, but this time I didn't go home. I sat in my car in the parking lot until sunrise, watching the building and trying to convince myself that exhaustion was playing tricks on my mind. Stress, overwork, the adjustment to night shift hours, there were rational explanations for everything I'd experienced. But the next day I received my first written warning. I'd been 5 minutes late for my shift, according to Mr. Harrison. My cleaning had been subpar, several areas missed entirely. My attitude had become noticeably poor, affecting the customer experience. None of it was true, but the documentation was official and final. "Is everything all right at home?" Harrison asked, but his concern felt performative, scripted. These kinds of performance issues, they tend to escalate if we don't address them early. I assured him everything was fine, that I'd do better. But as I signed the warning acknowledgement, I caught a glimpse of my reflection in his office window. For just a moment, my face had that same expression I'd seen in the concession counter glass. That look of terrible understanding. The pattern became clear over the following days, small infractions, minor mistakes that somehow became major issues. Equipment I'd turned off found running the next morning. Cleaning supplies left in the wrong locations. Customer complaints about my attitude, though I barely interacted with customers during the late shift. Each infraction brought another meeting with Harrison, another form to sign, and each time, that reflection grew clearer, more defined. I was becoming one of them, one of the faces in the glass. The final incident happened on a Tuesday night in October. I was closing Theater 7 again, the same room where I'd first heard the popcorn machine start itself. As I worked my way down the rows, collecting the scattered debris of another evening's entertainment, I felt that familiar pressure in the air. The silence grew heavier, more expectant. The screen flickered to life without warning. This time the figure wasn't a distant silhouette. It filled the entire display, massive and detailed. I could see its face, or what should have been its face. Instead, there was only a smooth, featureless surface, like an unfinished sculpture. Its arms were indeed too long, ending in hands that weren't quite human. And the container it held wasn't empty. It was filled with faces, hundreds of them, layered and compressed like discarded masks. They shifted and moved within the confines of the bucket, their expressions cycling through confusion, recognition, and finally, acceptance. "Your shell is ready," the figure said, and its voice no longer whispered. It spoke clearly, with the authority of something that had waited patiently and would not be denied. Step forward. I found myself moving toward the screen, though I hadn't consciously decided to walk. My legs carried me down the sloped floor, closer to that impossible display. The faces in the container turned to watch my approach, and I recognized some of them, former employees whose names I'd heard in passing, people who had simply stopped showing up. "It won't hurt," the figure continued. "The shell is already loosening. Just a little more pressure and it'll slip right off." The pressure, the meetings with Harrison, the impossible infractions, the gradual erosion of my position here. It wasn't random harassment. It was a process, A careful, methodical loosening of whatever connected me to this place, this job, this version of myself. I was 3 feet from the screen when I stopped. The realization hit me like cold water. I had a choice. The figure waited, patient and eternal, but it couldn't simply take what it wanted. It needed cooperation, compliance. It needed me to step forward willingly, to accept that my time here was over. Instead, I turned and ran. I didn't stop at the projection booth or the lobby. I ran straight to the employee entrance, through the maze of corridors that connected the theaters to the management offices. Harrison's office was dark, but his computer was still logged in. A violation of protocol that would have earned any employee a suspension. I found what I was looking for in the personnel files. 17 terminations in 3 years, just as I'd thought. But the dates were wrong. Each employee had been fired on the same day they'd stopped showing up. Not the day after, not following some gradual process of warnings and infractions. The same day. According to the digital timestamps, Harrison had processed my termination paperwork at 11:47 p.m., 23 minutes ago. The reason listed was job abandonment, failure to complete assigned duties. But I was still here, still working my shift, still fighting to hold on to whatever was left of myself. I printed the termination notice and walked back to Theater 7. The figure was waiting, exactly as I'd left it. The screen blazed with that impossible light, and the bucket of faces turned to watch my return. "Your shell," it said simply. "It's time." I held up the printed paper. "According to this, I don't work here anymore. I was terminated 23 minutes ago for job abandonment." The figure tilted its head, and for the first time it seemed confused. The shell must be loosened gradually. The process takes time. "What if it doesn't?" I asked. "What if someone finds out they've been fired before you can harvest their shell? What if they refuse to play along?" The faces in the container began to move more rapidly, their expression shifting to something like hope. The figure's grip on the bucket tightened, and the screen flickered. "Impossible," it whispered. "No one leaves. No one refuses." But even as it spoke, I could see cracks appearing in the display. Thin lines of normal darkness creeping in around the edges, breaking up that impossible light. The figure itself began to fade, becoming translucent. "I'm not quitting," I said, louder now. "I'm not giving notice. I'm not playing along with your little process. I'm already fired, remember? So I don't have to follow the rules anymore." The screen went dark. For a moment, Theater 7 was silent except for the ventilation system and the distant hum of the building's electrical systems. Normal sounds, ordinary and reassuring. Then, gradually, I heard something else. Laughter. Not the figure's voice, but something lighter. Multiple voices, actually, echoing from the speakers around the theater. The faces in the bucket. They were laughing. Free, finally, from whatever force had held them. The screen stayed dark. I found my resignation letter on Harrison's desk the next morning, already signed and dated. According to the paperwork, I'd submitted it 3 days ago, citing personal reasons and thanking the management for the opportunity to work at such a fine establishment. The security footage for that night was corrupted. Just 3 hours of static where my confrontation with the figure should have been. The popcorn machine had suffered some kind of mechanical failure and would need to be replaced. The projection system in Theater 7 required extensive repairs that would take weeks to complete. I never saw the figure again, but I still avoid movie theaters. Sometimes late at night, I wonder if I really won that confrontation or if it was just another part of the process. Maybe the figure found a new approach, a different way to harvest whatever it was seeking. Maybe I'm still trapped in some elaborate system, convinced of my freedom while actually moving through another carefully designed pattern. But the faces in the glass, I never see them anymore. And in the end, maybe that's enough. The Meridian Multiplex closed 6 months later, citing declining attendance and rising operational costs. They demolished the building last spring and put up a strip mall. There's a Subway now where Theater 7 used to be, and a nail salon where the concession stand once stood. I drive past sometimes, just to make sure it's really gone. The subway employees seem happy enough, and I've never noticed any unusual employee turnover, but I don't linger, and I definitely don't go inside. Some shells, once cracked, can never be completely sealed again. Story 13. The first time my spoon disappeared, I blamed exhaustion. 12-hour shifts at the warehouse had left my mind foggy, my hands clumsy. I'd probably dropped it somewhere, kicked it under the stove, or buried it in yesterday's dishes. These things happen when you live alone. Objects migrate like lost thoughts, settling in places that make no sense until you retrace your steps with the patience of an archaeologist. But the spoon kept vanishing. Not every day, but often enough to establish a pattern that gnawed at the edges of my sanity. I'd use it for my morning coffee, rinse it, place it in the drawer with the deliberate care of someone trying to prove their own competence. By evening, it would be gone. I'd search the apartment methodically, under cushions, behind the microwave, inside jacket pockets I hadn't worn in months. Nothing. Then it would reappear. Never where I'd left it. The first time I found it balanced on top of the bookshelf, its silver surface gleaming like a beacon 8 feet above the floor. The second time, it lay behind the television, nestled against the wall where dust bunnies gathered like gray conspiracies. Each discovery felt like a small victory followed immediately by a larger defeat, because I couldn't remember putting it there, couldn't construct any logical narrative that explained its migration. I started leaving myself notes. Spoon in drawer, 7:23 p.m. The handwriting looked increasingly frantic as the weeks passed, as if my pen were trying to anchor reality through sheer force of documentation. I bought a second spoon, then a third, thinking redundancy might solve the problem. But it was always that spoon, the one with the slightly bent handle, the one I'd inherited from my grandmother, that chose to wander. Sleep became elusive. I'd lie in bed listening to the building's nocturnal symphony, the whisper of settling wood, the distant hum of refrigerators, the occasional footstep from the apartment above. Normal sounds that had never bothered me before suddenly seemed loaded with intention, as if the building itself were holding its breath, waiting for something to begin. The paranoia crept in gradually, like water seeping through hairline cracks. I started timing my departures, memorizing the exact position of every object in my kitchen before leaving for work. I installed a small security camera, one of those cheap wireless models that promised peace of mind for $99. The footage showed nothing unusual, just my empty apartment maintaining its stubborn silence while shadows crawled across the walls in slow motion. But the spoon kept moving. I began to suspect my upstairs neighbor, Mrs. Chen, a woman in her 70s who moved with the determined shuffle of someone who refused to acknowledge the limitations of age. Perhaps she had a key from the previous tenant. Perhaps she was suffering from some form of dementia that drove her to rearrange other people's belongings. The theory felt solid until I remembered that Mrs. Chen was confined to a wheelchair, and the bookshelf where I'd found the spoon was definitely beyond her reach. Then there was Mr. Rodriguez next door, a man who'd lost his hearing in the Navy and compensated with a smile that seemed to understand everything despite catching nothing. Sometimes I'd see him in the hallway, nodding at conversations he couldn't hear, his eyes tracking movement with the intensity of someone reading lips in a foreign language. Could he somehow be involved? The thought felt absurd even as it formed, but absurdity had become my new normal. The breakthrough came on a Tuesday morning in October. I'd worked a double shift and stumbled home at dawn, my body demanding sleep but my mind too wired to comply. That's when I saw Mr. Rodriguez kneeling by his door, his weathered hands cradling something small and metallic. My spoon. It was covered in dust, as if it had been buried or hidden for months rather than missing for a single night. Tiny particles clung to its surface like gray snow, and when Mr. Rodriguez looked up at me, his expression held no surprise, no guilt. Just a weary recognition, as if we were both actors in a play neither of us had auditioned for. He handed me the spoon without speaking, his fingers lingering on mine for a moment longer than necessary. His skin felt paper-thin and surprisingly warm, and in that brief contact, I sensed something that made my stomach clench with inexplicable dread. He wasn't taking my spoon. He was returning it. That night, I didn't sleep at all. Instead, I sat in my kitchen chair, the recovered spoon clutched in my palm like a talisman, waiting for answers that refused to come. The building settled around me with its usual creaks and sighs, but underneath the familiar sounds, I began to hear something else, a faint metallic tapping that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. Tap, tap, tap. The sound was rhythmic but irregular, like Morse code transmitted by someone who'd forgotten the proper spacing between letters. It started somewhere near the front door, traveled along the wall toward the kitchen, then faded into silence. I pressed my ear against the drywall, feeling the cool surface against my cheek, and heard nothing but my own pulse thundering in my ears. But the next night, it happened again. This time I was ready. I followed the sound through my apartment, my bare feet silent on the hardwood floor, the spoon still clutched in my hand. The tapping moved with purpose, tracing a path that made no architectural sense, up walls, across ceilings, down into corners where two surfaces met at impossible angles. It was as if something were mapping the building's skeleton, learning its hidden geometry one tap at a time. I opened my door and peered into the hallway, half expecting to find someone crouched in the shadows with a hammer or a wrench. The corridor stretched empty in both directions, lit by flickering fluorescent bulbs that cast everything in sick yellow pools. But the tapping continued, and now I could hear it clearly. The unmistakable sound of metal striking wood, moving through the walls like a signal passing through a vast network. That's when I remembered what the building superintendent had mentioned during my lease signing, a casual comment I'd dismissed at the time. The previous tenant in my apartment, a man named Walter Finch, had been found dead in his chair after 3 days, surrounded by notebooks filled with architectural sketches and floor plans. Natural causes, the super had assured me. Just an old man whose heart gave out. But he'd been obsessed with the building's layout, convinced that the walls contained hidden passages, secret routes that connected every apartment to some central point. Crazy old bastard, the super had said with a laugh that didn't quite reach his eyes. Always tapping on walls, listening for hollow spots. Kept the neighbors awake with all that noise. Now, standing in my doorway at 3 a.m, I understood with crystalline clarity that Walter Finch hadn't been crazy. He'd been a cartographer of the invisible, using sound to navigate spaces that existed between the official blueprints. And somehow, my spoon had become his instrument, his conductor's baton in a symphony I was only beginning to hear. The tapping stopped abruptly, leaving behind a silence so complete it felt oppressive. I retreated to my apartment and locked the door, but sleep remained impossible. Instead, I spent the remaining hours until dawn researching Walter Finch online, trying to piece together the fragments of a life that had ended in my kitchen chair. What I found unsettled me more than I'd expected. Walter had been a civil engineer before retirement, specializing in the structural analysis of older buildings. His professional website, still cached on forgotten servers, contained dozens of articles about hidden architectural features in pre-war construction, servant passages, dumbwaiters, utility tunnels that had been walled up and forgotten over the decades. One article in particular caught my attention. It described a building in Chicago where residents had reported strange sounds in the walls, objects moving overnight, and a persistent sense of being watched. Walter's investigation had revealed a network of narrow passages connecting every apartment to a central observation post, originally built for the live-in superintendent to monitor tenant activities during the Depression era. Buildings remember, Walter had written in his conclusion. They hold on to the purposes they were designed for, even when those purposes become obsolete or uncomfortable. Sometimes, all they need is someone willing to listen. The next evening, I made a decision that felt both inevitable and terrifying. I took my spoon and walked to the front door, then knelt and placed it carefully on the hallway floor. The metal rang softly against the tiles, a clear note that seemed to hang in the air longer than physics should have allowed. Then I waited. The tapping began almost immediately, but this time it was different, more complex, more purposeful. Instead of the random percussion I'd grown accustomed to, the sound formed patterns, created rhythms that felt almost like language. It moved through the walls with increasing confidence, sketching routes I could almost visualize. From my door to Mrs. Chen's apartment above, down to the basement storage rooms, up to the roof access, creating a three-dimensional map of connections I'd never imagined. As the night progressed, I began to understand what Walter Finch had discovered. The building wasn't just a collection of separate units stacked like boxes. It was an organism, a living system with its own circulation and nervous pathways. The tapping wasn't random noise, it was communication, a request for guidance from something that needed to move through those hidden spaces but had lost its way. By morning, my spoon was gone again, but this time I wasn't surprised. I knew where it had gone, knew what purpose it was serving. Walter Finch had trained it, taught it to be a conductor's baton for the invisible orchestra that lived in our walls. Now it was mapping new routes, creating fresh pathways for whatever traveled through the building's secret anatomy. I could stop it, I knew. I could refuse to participate, could ignore the tapping and let whatever needed guidance remain lost in the darkness between walls. But as I stood in my kitchen, looking at the empty drawer where my spoon should have been, I realized I didn't want to stop it. Because the truth was, I wasn't really alone in this building. None of us were. Something moved through the hidden spaces Walter Finch had discovered, something that needed direction, needed someone to help it navigate the maze of forgotten passages and walled-up routes. My spoon had become its compass, and I had become its reluctant cartographer. The thought should have terrified me, but instead, it brought an odd sense of purpose. I walked to my silverware drawer and selected a fork this time, its tines gleaming in the morning light. Tonight, I would place it by the door, would offer it to the darkness that lived between my walls. And tomorrow, I would listen as new routes were drawn. New paths were discovered in the geography of the invisible. Outside my window, the city hummed with its usual morning chaos. Traffic and construction, voices and sirens, the endless percussion of urban life. But underneath it all, if I listened carefully, I could hear something else. The faint metallic tapping that connected every building, every hidden space, every forgotten corner where the architecture held its breath and waited for someone to remember its true purpose. Walter Finch had been the first conductor in our building, but he wouldn't be the last. The orchestra was growing, learning new movements, and it needed musicians who understood that some music could only be heard in the spaces between what we thought we knew. Tonight, I would add my own voice to the symphony. Story 14. The brass mechanism had stopped at exactly 7:17 p.m., frozen like a photograph of time itself. I discovered this detail 3 days after the funeral, when I finally found the courage to enter Grandma's bedroom and collect the music box she'd promised me since childhood. The tiny ballerina stood motionless on her single toe, arms raised in eternal arabesque. Her pink tutu faded to the color of old roses. The intricate mahogany box bore scratches and dents from decades of handling, its velvet lining worn smooth by countless openings and closings. When I wound the brass key, nothing happened. The mechanism felt jammed, resistant, as if something inside had crystallized at the moment of her passing. I should have left it there. Instead, I wrapped the music box in my grandmother's favorite shawl and carried it home to my apartment, where it now sat on my kitchen table like an accusation. The afternoon light streaming through my windows seemed to avoid it, creating a subtle shadow that extended far beyond the box's modest dimensions. That first evening, I attempted various repairs. I oiled the mechanism, adjusted the spring tension, even contemplated dismantling the entire apparatus. Nothing worked. The ballerina remained frozen, and an inexplicable chill had settled into my apartment despite the heater running at full capacity. At 7:16 p.m., I was washing dishes when the first note chimed. The sound pierced through the running water like a needle through fabric, clear, deliberate, unmistakable. I turned off the faucet, and in the sudden silence, heard the familiar melody my grandmother used to play for me during childhood visits, Fur-Elise, but slower than I remembered, each note hanging in the air longer than seemed physically possible. I approached the music box with the caution of someone approaching a sleeping animal. The ballerina was turning, her movements jerky and unnatural, As if the mechanism was fighting against its own operation, the melody continued, note by perfect note, while the brass key remained completely motionless. The song ended at exactly 7:17 p.m. Then the front door swung open. No wind, no draft, no explanation. The deadbolt remained engaged, the chain lock still fastened, yet the door stood wide open to the empty hallway beyond. I closed it, checked the locks twice, and spent the remainder of the evening convincing myself that old buildings settle in strange ways, that doors sometimes warp and springs sometimes fail. The music box sat silent and still, offering no answers. The second night, I was ready. I positioned myself in the living room with a clear view of both the kitchen table and the front door. At 7:15 p.m., I started a stopwatch and focused intently on the music box, determined to catch whatever mechanical explanation I had missed. 7:16 p.m. arrived with the precision of a surgeon's blade. The first note resonated from the box, but this time I noticed something I had missed before. The melody wasn't quite for Elise. The rhythm was wrong, the spacing between notes irregular. Some notes held longer than others, some cut short, creating a pattern that seemed almost deliberate. As the ballerina turned her stilted dance, the bathroom window creaked open. I heard it distinctly, the protest of old hinges, the whisper of glass sliding against its frame. When I investigated, the window stood fully open to the night air, though I was certain I had checked all the windows before settling in for my vigil. But it was the shadow that made my hands shake. Projected against the bathroom wall by no light source I could identify, the silhouette of an elderly woman stood perfectly still. Not the distorted, angular shadow that objects typically cast, but a precise profile I would have recognized anywhere. The set of her shoulders, the particular way she held her head slightly tilted to the left, details that existed nowhere except in my memory of my grandmother. The shadow remained motionless until the music stopped at 7:17 p.m., then faded like smoke. I closed the window, returned to the living room, and stared at the music box until dawn. Research became my obsession. I spent hours online, diving into forums about antique music boxes, mechanical restoration, and the physics of sound production. Every technical explanation fell short of accounting for what I was experiencing. Music boxes don't play without wound springs. Doors don't open without force applied to their handles. Windows don't slide open against friction and gravity. Yet every evening at 7:16 p.m., the impossible became routine. By the fifth night, I had mapped the pattern. The melody lasted exactly 1 minute, during which various doors or windows throughout my apartment would open in sequence. Always the same progression. Front door, bathroom window, bedroom closet, kitchen cabinet, hall closet door. Each opening accompanied by that unmistakable shadow, always in a different room, always perfectly still, always recognizably hers. The pattern was too precise to be random, too consistent to be coincidence. I began to suspect the melody itself was the key. Using an old Morse code chart I found online, I started transcribing the notes. Long notes for dashes, short notes for dots, using the pauses between phrases as letter separations. The work was painstaking, requiring me to play back the mental recording of the melody over and over, but gradually, a message emerged. COMEWITHME. The words materialized from the pattern of notes like a photograph developing in darkness. Come with me. Not a request, not an invitation, an instruction. That night I didn't wait for 7:16 p.m. I was going to dismantle the music box before it could play again, before the message could repeat, before whatever was happening could escalate beyond my ability to control. The screws that held the mechanism in place were old and stubborn, but I managed to remove the outer casing. Inside, the complexity of gears and springs was beautiful and alien, like the workings of some intricate trap. As I carefully lifted out the cylindrical drum that controlled the melody, I noticed something that made my breath catch. Tiny marks had been scratched into the metal surface, deliberate scratches that didn't match the wear patterns of normal use. Fresh scratches that caught the light differently than the surrounding brass. Someone had modified the drum. The scratches formed a clear pattern when I held the drum up to the light, a series of long and short marks that exactly matched the Morse code I had transcribed. But beneath those fresh scratches, barely visible but unmistakably present, were older marks, deeper, worn smooth by time, layer upon layer of messages, carved into the metal across years, perhaps decades. I was still examining the drum when the clock on my wall chimed 7:16 p.m. The music began anyway. Without the box, without the mechanism, without any possible source, the release started playing from somewhere inside my apartment. The melody was clearer now, no longer filtered through brass and springs, and I could hear additional layers I had missed before. Harmonies that shouldn't exist in a single-note music box melody. Counterpoint that suggested multiple instruments playing in perfect, impossible synchronization. Every door and window in my apartment swung open simultaneously. The shadows that appeared weren't just my grandmother's profile anymore. Multiple silhouettes filled my walls, generations of figures standing in poses I almost recognized. Family photographs come to life, projected by light that existed nowhere in my apartment. And in the center of them all, clearer than the rest, my grandmother's shadow raised one arm toward me. The message in the melody had changed. As I listened with growing dread, I realized the Morse code was spelling out something new. TIMETOCOMEHOME. The music grew louder, though that should have been impossible without speakers or amplification. The shadows on my walls began to move, turning toward me with synchronous precision. The temperature in my apartment dropped so rapidly that my breath became visible, and frost began forming on the inside of my windows. But it was the sound beneath the melody that finally shattered my rational mind. Whispers. Dozens of voices, maybe hundreds, speaking in rhythm with the music. Words I couldn't quite understand in languages I didn't recognize, but the intent was unmistakable. They were calling to me, welcoming me, preparing space for me in whatever place they occupied. I ran. I left everything, my keys, my wallet, my coat, and fled my apartment, the music box drum still clutched in my trembling hand. The melody followed me into the hallway, through the building, out onto the street where normal sounds of traffic and humanity gradually overwhelmed the impossible symphony. I didn't stop running until I reached the all-night diner 6 blocks away, where fluorescent lights and the smell of coffee provided anchor points to reality. Now I sit here, writing this account as the clock approaches midnight. The drum rests on the formica table before me, its scratched surface catching the harsh light. I've been examining those marks for hours, and I've made a discovery that I wish I could unknow. The newest scratches, the ones that form the Morse code message, weren't made by my grandmother. The metal around them is too bright, too fresh. These marks were made after her death. After I brought the music box home, which means something else has been modifying the mechanism. Something that has access to my apartment when I'm not there. Something that wanted me to discover the message, to decode it, to understand what was being asked of me. The clock on the wall reads 11:58 p.m. In 18 minutes, it will be 7:16 a.m. I wonder if the music plays twice daily, or if the pattern is tied to something else entirely. I wonder if distance matters, or if I'll hear the melody regardless of where I am. I wonder if the shadow figures are already waiting in my apartment, growing impatient. Most of all, I wonder if I'm losing my mind, or if losing my mind is exactly what I'm supposed to believe. The drum feels warm in my hands now, warmer than it should after sitting in the cold diner air. When I hold it up to the light, I can see new scratches appearing as I watch, forming slowly like writing in invisible ink exposed to heat. They spell DONTRUN. I can feel them watching me through the diner windows, though when I look up, I see only the empty street and my own reflection staring back with eyes I barely recognize. The melody has started again, faint but unmistakable, rising from the brass drum in my hands. I think it's time to go home.